Okay, I think we'll get started. Again, welcome everyone to the fourth conference of the Sandplain Grassland Network. I'm Karen Lombard, the Director of Stewardship and Restoration at the Massachusetts chapter of the Nature Conservancy. I'm one of the steering committee members of the network. The network launched in 2016 with a focus on conservation and restoration of sandplain grasslands and heathlands. We have a steering committee of 12 that meets monthly. And we've got the logos up here on the slide, and several of us are helping to facilitate today. We have a website that summarizes the knowledge of this natural community type and also lists all the steering committee members. On that website, we also try to put blog posts up regularly on field trips, projects, grants that impact sandplain grasslands, and submissions are accepted. We have published one paper so far as a network and have another one that we are about to submit for publication, and that will be discussed by Mike Whittemore today. We try to do an online conference every other year. Today we have 21 presentations, a mix of longer presentations and lightning talks, with the majority focused on the biodiversity of sandplain grasslands, our theme for this year's conference. Thanks to you all who have volunteered to present, and to the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange for hosting us and helping to organize this conference. Just a few logistics. We know we have a lot packed in today, and given the tight schedule, we're going to really try to stay on time. Please take breaks as you need to. We will have two 10-minute breaks and a 30-minute lunch break. Any presenters who haven't checked to make sure their presentation is working, we'll have you do that during the breaks. There will hopefully be time for questions after each talk, depending if the presenter leaves enough time. There will also be a small amount of time before each break for additional questions. Please put your questions in the chat. We are keeping videos off and folks muted for bandwidth when you're not presenting. So if you aren't turned off, please do that. And note that we are recording the conference, and we will post it both on the Sandplain Grassland Network as well as the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange websites. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris Neal to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks everybody for joining us. I see we have 100 people online, which I think is a testament to the value of us forming this network in the first place. It's the idea of the network is a place to share information. These conferences are part of that mission, but we welcome interactions, and we welcome you to expand your network with other people who are on this conference. So I want to kick us off. I'm thrilled that we have as a featured first speaker today, Jesse Nippert from Kansas State University. Jesse is also the lead principal investigator of the Konza Long-Term Ecological Research Project, which is near Kansas State in Manhattan, Kansas. Jesse has a long history of ecological research on grasslands and other ecosystems, and especially in the creative use of stable isotopes to try to understand water and nutrient cycles in prairie systems. But one of the phenomena that's occurring right now in the prairies, especially the sort of eastern edge of the intermediate short grass, tall grass prairie, is expansion of shrubs into prairies that threatens the biodiversity, threatens the sort of the structure, and is changing prairies across the continent and changing grasslands across the globe as disturbances like fire regimes are changing. And we've experienced that in our own backyard here in the Northeast, where managers who are struggling to maintain sandplain grasslands are dealing with this sort of the march of the woody vegetation into prairies, and we're as a network we're challenged by trying to maintain grasslands as grasslands and trying to figure out what disturbance regimes work best. But so that's going to be the topic of Jesse's talk this morning: options to boost resilience following shrub invasion of grasslands. And I think it's just great that he's here. And please welcome Jesse Nippert.
All right. Thanks everyone for having me. I'm going to share my screen. All right.
Looks great.
You can see it? All right.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for having me here today. It's my pleasure to talk to you about some of our research that we've been doing in mesite grassland. I realize that it's a slightly different ecosystem, but the consequences of woody plant encroachment apply to a lot of us, and this is a global phenomenon. So I'll do my best to set up the question and then kind of walk you through some of the things that we've been seeing. So there's many different types of woody species that are responsible for this. One of the things that's been the most difficult are the clonal species. And for us, these clonal shrubs tend to be some of the most pernicious problems. And in this opening slide that I have here, you can see that we've recently pushed a fire through this system. In this case, in this foreground, this was only a week before, and the shrubs are already regreening back up. And so it's one of these things where we're going to have to think about some different strategies and solutions. One of the things when I talk to folks about this problem that I normally need to spend a little bit of time like adjusting our perceptions about like what is a grassland. When we think about grasslands, what is it that we are what is it that we're thinking of? There we go. So we all have some sort of picture in our mind of when we think of that term, a grassland. And it might be something that looks like this, an unspoiled, vista in the Western United States of some days gone by. It might be something that looks like this, where you think about, if we were to go back in time just 100 years ago, 200 years ago, what large sections of North America would have looked like. And then here's what it can look like today. This is part of the Konza Prairie where I work in the spring when those new grasses are just coming up after fire. And the landscape is just glowing green. In scenarios like this and what we consider to be natural grasslands, woody plants tend to be fairly minimal. They tend to be confined to like waterways like this one that you can see down here in the lower portion. And so you can kind of think about woody plants as being pretty segregated on the landscape. The reason why this occurs is through the frequent use of fire. So for many grasslands, especially a mesite grassland like the one that I live in, fire is the key regulator or one of the key regulators of this ecosystem. And it's the main check that historically would have kept woody plants from expanding. It's more difficult to get woody plants out once they've already got in because they have the potential to grow out of a fire trap. But in this circumstance, you can see that fire tends to play a key regulating role. When we think about our grasslands, though, it's not just fire that sort of like regulates these processes. It's also grazing, tend to think of it grazing by large ungulates. And then it's also the role of climate. Climate plays a key structuring factor along with fire and grazing in regulating grassland processes. Species diversity is a key element of grasslands and one that at the Konza Prairie and with our partners at the Nature Conservancy and elsewhere, we're very aware of, and we make decisions to maximize and maintain high species richness and diversity. But that's not the only thing that grasslands provide. One of the things that I think is kind of unique and something that we don't study quite as much are the feedbacks. So trying to understand these feedbacks between the land surface and the atmosphere with the soil. And then as we go down, a lot of our work at Konza and other places in the Great Plains is focused on understanding these subsurface processes, especially the interplay between the saturated and unsaturated zones of the soil. And one of the reasons why we've had such a focus on that is associated with long-term stream drying. Many of our small headwater streams in the central part of the continent either are drying or have dried up. And so there's been quite a bit of work trying to understand how that phenomenon might be linked to some of these other processes we're seeing across the landscape. So one of the things that I will frequently hear when I give presentations like this is you'll hear people say, isn't that process of transition from a grassland to a forest just natural? It's just part of this natural part of the ecosystem. And plus humans, we're not a part of the ecosystem. And so if you have to be burning by humans, is that really part of the system dynamics? And for us, um, we often, and I dismiss that supposition and tend to remind people that in our current iteration of the grasslands here in the Great Plains, there have always been humans on this landscape at the end of the Pleistocene. And those humans that were on this landscape started using fire. And so for at least the last 10,000 years, frequent fire and the continuation of this grassland has been sort of a key element of this landscape. It's only in the last couple hundred years when European settlers basically have disrupted the fire history that we've started to see this transition into four different potential states: the maintenance of the grassy ecosystem, the development into a shrubland or a woodland, or in some cases, when things have been mismanaged, you can transition into a degraded state that's difficult to recover from. So again, we view fire and the human use of fire on the landscape as being a natural and needed component of our management of this ecosystem type. So there's a lot of challenges for all ecosystems. There's a lot of challenges for us trying to maintain processes here in Kansas in the broader Flint Hills of the Great Plains. Typically, when we think about grassland loss, we think about conversion to agriculture or conversion into urbanized areas. And that's true. We are still losing land to those processes. But one of the main things we've been losing it to is woody encroachment. This process of natural or native woody species replacing grasses and then becoming like a larger portion of the cover on the landscape. One of the things that is interesting is because of other changes in our environment around us, you can view these changes as being difficult to recover from because we now live in a no analog world. There's no frame of reference for what we're living through over the last 10,000 years here in North America. And so providing solutions to woody encroachment is often going to require novel thinking. It's going to require things that are potentially outside of what has happened in the past. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about is how can we manage, how can we combine different strategies and ways to find solutions to these problems. So you might be thinking to yourself, so what's changed besides just fire? Like what is it that has changed that has made woody encroachment a global phenomenon and one that is impacting all herbaceous ecosystems from herbaceous portions of Alaska all the way down into the pampas of Argentina to throughout Africa, etc. So what is it that's going on? You can think about there being a variety of things that all tend to favor woody plants over grassy ones. The three key ones are changes in fire frequency and intensity or outright suppression. There's oftentimes a lot of human fears associated with fire. And then as people move into the landscape, there's fears associated with property damage and risk of humans associated in towns. There's also changes in our climate. So changes in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere favors woody plants over our grasses, as well as changes in climate associated with precipitation, timing, and intensity. And then finally, large portions of our landscape, of course, used to be home to large migratory herds of ungulates, both bison, of course, but then also things like elk. And as they would have moved across the landscape, they would have kept these woody plants in check to a certain extent, promoting grasses on those landscapes. When we're thinking about changes in woody encroachment, the scale matters. It's not just at the patch scale, but it's at the regional scale. So the development of conservation solutions is going to depend upon how many woody species are already there. What's the size of your prairie? What's your ability to constrain it? And then what are the overall goals? So in this cartoon that I have shown here in the yellow stippling is the Flint Hills region of eastern Kansas. This is where the vast majority of the tallgrass prairie still resides, of like the intact native tallgrass prairie. Of course, this was once a vast ecosystem that spanned from Illinois all the way over to us in Kansas, and then from Minnesota all the way down to Texas. And there's only roughly 2% of this once great ecosystem that's left. One of the most well-studied grasslands on the planet is at the Konza Prairie. You know, we're this tallgrass prairie that's just outside of Manhattan, Kansas, in the northern portion of the Flint Hills. The Konza Prairie is part of the National Science Foundation Long-Term Ecological Research Network. The Konza Prairie for the last 50 years has used a landscape design. We're like one very large experimental landscape. You guys might be familiar with Hubbard Brook and how it's divided into watersheds of varying treatment, and we're the same way. And so these watersheds at the Konza Prairie are divided into varying fire frequencies and then combinations of with and without grazing by large ungulates. Using this template, there's roughly about over 2,000 scientific publications that have come off Konza. And I think we have trained somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 graduate students over this, last few decades. And so there is a very rich body of evidence for understanding how mesic grasslands function by being able to intensively study this site. In the context of changes that are happening around us, there's been a considerable focus on understanding resilience. You can think about Konza Prairie and resilience in three sort of key ways: a shrub encroached one that has reduced diversity and reduced herbaceous productivity. You can have diverse, rich herbaceous that often includes grazers. And then you can have herbaceous that's grass dominated and is lower diversity. And so one of the things we've spent a lot of time doing is trying to understand, how do we boost resilience? How do we keep grassland in that grassland state? And how do we provide key ecosystem functions that benefit humans and then the plants and animals that live on the landscape? So sometimes, because woody encroachment and change often can happen slow, it's hard to see things happening over the time span of human careers and when we're working on the landscape. But by collecting long-term data, you can see these things happening basically to a fuller extent. So this is a picture that comes from some of my colleagues at the University of Nebraska, where they mapped juniper expansion starting in the 1980s and 1990s down in Texas and Oklahoma, and then moving northward over the last 30 years. And so this is often referred to as the Green Glacier, referring to the march of the juniper across the landscape. We could have also done this at Konza Prairie with a variety of ways. Here's 3 different watersheds with 3 different fire intensities. The top row is burned every year, the middle row is burned once every 4 years, and the bottom row is burned once every 20 years. And then you can see the dates of measurements, and the black dots represent individual woody plants on the landscape. And so you can see through time with these fire frequencies how woody plant encroachment has occurred. One thing of note, when Konza Prairie was being established in the 1970s, the 4-year fire frequency, that middle row, was picked as the control. The long-term frequency of fire in our region using paleo data was about once every 4 years. And you can now see that that long-term fire frequency that used to maintain the system in the herbaceous state can no longer maintain it. It's lost the woody vegetation. Once the woody vegetation comes in, fire, it has an inability to actually regulate the problem once that gets into a certain extent. This is one of those 20-year watersheds. A fire was pushed through, and we did it under the most extreme conditions that we felt comfortable managing it. And you can see that even a week later, you have cedars, which are fire susceptible and don't resprout, next to ones that died. Some are alive. And then a huge portion of the landscape, these clonal shrubs, were completely unimpacted by the fact that we pushed a fire through. So once they get in, it's difficult to regulate them with fire in the same ways we would have done it in the past. So when you look across the landscape, it's not just one type of species that is responsible for woody encroachment. Here in the foreground, we have sumac, which is a low-statured shrub. We have trees that are along a string bank in the middle, And in the background, you can see roughleaf dogwood, which is a large clonal shrub that exists on the background. Through the data we collect at Konza Prairie, in addition to those other photos that we were just showing you, you can look at how fire frequency changes things over time. This is different watersheds than those I just shown you. These are in areas that are grazed by bison. You can see that even in the areas that are burned every year, we've had some shrub encroachment that has happened on this landscape, associated with the fact that the grazing animals are reducing some of the competitive ability of the grasses to keep the shrubs out. And so by collecting long-term data, it provides some input and it provides us the perspective to start to develop tools and solutions to manage this problem. So what are some of the consequences? One of the big ones, of course, that you guys already are aware of is changes in species richness and diversity. But there's a lot of things that are sort of happening on this landscape. One of the key ones that you can also think of is for regions that have a sustained grazing economy, the reduction in forage is a reduction in the carrying capacity of the landscape, and it has direct impacts on livelihoods. Because deer tend to hang out in our woody areas, there's become very large tick risks associated with the transition, and that disease threat, is quite large across the landscape. You can also start to think about changes in hydrological and biogeochemical cycles. Woody plants use a lot more water than the herbaceous plants that they replace. We have changes in runoff. We've had a lot of reduced stream flow, like I've talked about. And then subsurface, working with a bunch of colleagues, we've really started to focus on critical zone dynamics, trying to understand this interplay between what's happening below ground and what's happening at the surface. And these changes include deep soil drying, changes in pathway. We're speeding up the karstification of our bedrock, so an accelerated bedrock weathering, and we're changing basically the types of carbon in our carbon pools. We often think about woody plants as adding more carbon to the landscape, but that's not always the case. So you can see there's a myriad of things that change when basically you have a state transition from a grassy state to a woody state. So one of the things that my lab does is we're quite focused on hydrology. So using a variety of techniques, one of the things we've been able to document is how changes in evapotranspiration have occurred over the landscape over a large period of time. So for this time scale and reference here, a nearly 40-year period, grass cover went down by 20%, and then the woody shrubs have increased by roughly 25% over that same period of time. Oh, I said that in the wrong way. It's been a roughly 25% increase in landscape evapotranspiration by the woody plants that have replaced the grassy ones on the ecosystem. That might not seem like a lot to you, but just in the Flint Hills in eastern Kansas per year, that's an extra 2.1 million acre feet of water that is lost. These woody plants use a lot of water. So you might be wondering, well, where is all that extra water coming from? We've used a variety of techniques. In this case, this cartoon is representing some measurements that are called electrical resistivity imaging, where you can actually map the availability of water at different depths in the soil profile. So we have a transect that goes from herbaceous to woody, and the darker red the shading is, the more drying it is occurring. And as these woody plants come in, they are depleting that deep soil moisture. Keep in mind that climate is a key regulator of the dynamics in this system. And when this deeper soil moisture is lost, the ability of plants on the landscape to utilize it during periods of drought goes away. So their resilience is eroded and they're more susceptible to drought. The woody plants also do something else that we've been studying. Because they have coarse roots that are replacing the fine roots of the herbaceous species, they create something called a soil macropore. And these soil macropores leave legacies in the soil similar to the ways you would think about legacies occurring with row crop agriculture. And so one of the things we've been wondering is, do these soil macropores created by these woody roots leave long-term legacies? So again, we use that electrical resistivity imaging. So in this cartoon, again, the shrubs on the right, the grasses on the left. And then we set up these sprinklers, and we basically just irrigated the system for periods of time to see where that water moved through the soil and how fast it moved. So in this case, the blue shading is reflecting the water from this irrigation experiment as it moves from the surface down to 2 meters deep in the soil. So you can see after 2 hours, some of the infiltration, 13 hours, 25 hours, and a day and a half later, you can see where that water is at in the soil. And you can see that in the grassy side, it's mostly contained in the top 1/2 meter to 3/4 of a meter. But in the woody side, and these woody shrubs have only been here, mind you, for roughly a decade or so, but the water falls out of the bottom of the system. And so it's reflecting these changes in soil structure in the macropores. So even if you were to come in and immediately rip out all of these woody plants in some drastic mechanical fashion, the soil has been altered. And so you're going to have changes in hydrology for long periods of time. So whenever I give a talk like this, I have folks say, like, sheesh, why are we doing something about this? And then I'll often get something along the lines of, can't we just start to manage the way that things were managed in the past? Both of these, both the concern and the suggestions about how to manage are very valid. There are lots of things that we need to be doing to try and get on top of this problem, to try and maintain basically this grassy state. Some of the suggestions that folks often say is like, well, why don't you just burn more? Or they'll say things like, why don't you cut them down? Or can you graze more? Or just get them with herbicides. So I'll walk through some of these, and none of these are unreasonable. Every individual landowner or land manager has to think about the solutions that they're comfortable with. One of the things that's difficult with fire is that the burn frequency has increased compared to the past for control. Like I mentioned a few slides ago, in the region of the country I'm in, we used to have fire about every 4 years. Now, if you have a burn frequency that is any less than every 2 years, you lose this site to woody plants. And in addition, we'll sometimes hear, well, why don't you burn just under hotter conditions? The hotter the fire is, the more risk it tends to be correlated with more wind and drier air conditions. And that's when you have the biggest potential for wildfire. So it requires quite a bit of safety. Why don't you cut them down? Well, most of our woody plants that have become a problem for us are clonal. And so cutting them down, they quickly regrow. And so that clonality of a lot of these woody shrubs makes it difficult to contain them with mechanical means. What about grazing and browsing? As I mentioned a few slides ago as well, grazing actually exacerbates the problem. Now, don't get me wrong, grasslands are meant to be grazed. But when the grazer keeps the grasses in check, the grasses lose some of their competitive ability to suppress the woody plants in terms of competition for resources, including water, nutrients, and light. The one element of ungulates that used to be on our landscape that is not are elk. Elk are a mixed feeder. They used to be a plains animal. Now elk are mostly confined into our mountainous regions, but they're only in the mountainous regions because they left the plains as we colonized the plains. And so the elk are one sort of missing component. Elk, of course, as a mixed feeder, eat grass when the grass is very nutritious, but they switch to woody forage during periods of the year when grasses have lost their protein concentration. So this is a zone of active research that we're working on right now, trying to understand the role of mixed feeders. The last thing that people always suggest is, why don't you just use herbicides? Herbicides are one tool in a toolkit that every individual has to decide if they're comfortable with and how they want to apply them. One of the things that as probably many of you, I have an uncomfortable relationship thinking about the use of herbicides in natural ecosystems because there often tends to be unintended consequences. But it might be something that, depending on your conditions, that you might want to consider. But the takeaway from all of this is there aren't really any easy solutions for this problem. And so as a consequence of that, we've been trying to spend some time thinking outside the box. We've also been trying to spend some time thinking about, do we need to readjust our expectations for what a healthy landscape looks like that we're wanting to manage? Because what if we're spending all of this time and our resources and our sanity trying to get back to some starting conditions that are no longer attainable? I started this talk showing you some pictures like vistas of grasslands. When you think about large open grassland spaces, what do you think of? And that's kind of the image that we all have in our head. But for all of these reasons that I have just talked about, we might need to be like adjusting how we think about this landscape. And the reason we might need to adjust it is because climate change has altered the baseline. With changes in CO2 concentration, with changes in fire frequency, changes in ungulates on the landscape, there's just so many things that have changed, and the landscapes tend to be so big that it becomes quite difficult to like think about how are we going to get this back. And one of the things that many of us have been worried about is if we're trying to pursue something that is unattainable at large scales, what if we miss the ability to protect rare species that are still there, rare habitat that still exists? So trying to balance on one hand a big picture goal for the conservation of an area. And then on the other hand, not forgetting about the things that still exist there right now, the things that basically we still can protect that can provide high quality ecosystem services. So again, working with a lot of my colleagues, both at universities as well as the Nature Conservancy, we've been basically trying to think about a new conceptual approach to this problem. One of the things that we've done is started to realize that in some cases, woody plants are going to be inevitable on the landscape. And in those circumstances, what are the things that we can do to maintain high ecosystem services, services in terms of habitat and forage and species richness and diversity, compared to the left-hand column that has low ecosystem services? We've got closed canopies with nothing that exists underneath them. You have the same shrub layers that suppress grass and suppress grassy growth. And so this framework is probably more achievable. It's going to cost less. And rather than just pursuing this one ideal, like in this case, native herbaceous, no woody plants, what if we're reframing our perspective and trying to think about, yes, we need that herbaceous vegetation, but what can we do in some circumstances? We're getting it back to that idealized native, all herbaceous type might not actually be possible. So one of the things we've been doing is trying to characterize this. What does high ecosystem services look like in grassland, shrubland, and woodland states? And one of the key things is structure. The maintenance of vertical structure within the canopy that allows species of different stature to exist in different portions of the landscape. So in this top one, in a predominantly high ecosystem services grassland, it's mostly herbaceous, and there's high quality forage, habitat, all of the things that you're already familiar with. In that middle panel, not all shrublands have a reduction in ecosystem services. If you can maintain some of that structural heterogeneity, it promotes and boosts resilience of many different species, along with providing other ecosystem services like carbon storage potential and other things. And in the bottom one, you can think about woodlands. There are open canopy woodlands that can exist up to something like 30% woody cover. And just like the shrublands, the key element here is maintaining that vertical habitat heterogeneity. And so one of the things that we've been promoting is on the landscape, maintain the grasslands that you can maintain. And in areas where the woody plants already exist, look for solutions that can open them up. And even if it doesn't convert back into what you think a pristine grassland should look like, you can still derive powerful ecosystem services from this landscape. So what are some tools and approaches to this problem? It's going to vary based on the agency or the land in which you're looking at. But one of the things that you need to start with is sort of identifying what your goals and objectives are. And those are going to be very personal for each location. They're going to include the outcomes and services that you want on the landscape, the means that you have basically to implement treatments and then maintain them over time, and an evaluation of the effectiveness of the treatments that might be there. So some just very generalized treatments that I have shown as images here, of course, are native and non-native mixed feeders up on the top screen. So goats in different locations can be a solution to the problem. And like I've been talking about, native ungulates as well is something that we've been spending a lot of time investigating. The middle panel is showing effective use of herbicides using drone technology. So now on large landscapes, if you can go out and you can map where your your problems of concern are, you can then make basically plans to have very specified treatment, herbicide treatment application done on only those locations. This sort of minimizes some of that collateral damage that can exist on the landscape. And in the bottom panels, of course, we have the use of fire. And then for our non-resprouting species, you can think about cutting them down. One of the things with mechanical clearing, though, to be aware of is depending on how this is performed, sometimes the tractors and the skid steers that are used basically to remove the plants can have quite considerable amount of soil damage. So it's something to be aware of. Step 2 that I have on this panel is getting at this idea, though, that you can impose one of these treatments, but more than likely the solution is going to include many of these treatments. So you're combining fire at one portion of the year with maybe herbicide a month or two later, and maybe in the fall, then you're trying to put a mixed feeder on the landscape. And it's this iteration. If you can stagger your treatments such that they're at different points in time when the woody plants might be the most susceptible, one of the things you can do is deplete them of their below ground carbohydrate reserves, and you have a better chance of killing some of these clonal plants. We've seen that time and time again with using only one of these, even every year, even herbicide, using it, at different times of the year, you will have very ineffective kill rates. But when you layer these things on iteratively and in an interactive capacity, you see a lot higher successes. So other things to think about as you're moving forward with trying to look at solutions is trying to think about the things that we can do as a collective and then things that we can do as an individual. One of the biggest things that we can do as individuals is communicate the problem. And so when you see places starting to becoming encroached, talk to folks about it. In addition, don't plant woody encroachers around on your property. Be very careful if you're developing shelter belts and things like that in terms of what species that you're planting. The key, though, is it's much easier to treat and constrain these things when they're seedlings compared to when they're adults. There's many of our state and federal agencies that are working on solutions, so supporting these groups goes a long way. And then think about different case-specific scenarios that we can develop that can get to some of these solutions that are specific to your place in terms of thinking about mechanical removal or grazers or herbicide or fire, etc. So identifying your goals, figuring out what's going to work based on the species and the extent of the problem, treatment plan, implement and monitor, and then continue to monitor. And that long-term monitoring will allow you to identify if you are actually resuming and redeveloping some of those desired positive ecosystem traits that you want back on the landscape. One of the things to keep in mind is that in our really large landscapes, we're at a point in time in North America and in many locations around the world where some increase in woody cover, even with active management, is probably going to be inevitable. So looking for solutions and looking for ways to layer these things on and being very intentional about what we're doing, we're at a point in time where we need to be doing that all the time. So where do I see some of the gaps and where do I see some hope for understanding this process? As I presented to you today, there's still so much to be learned to understand how our surface and subsurface dynamics, this idea of the critical zone of our living earth, how these things are interacting. So woody plants don't just change things above ground, they're changing it below ground. Broad conservation frameworks. So the resist, accept, and direct, the RAD framework, is one of many possible tools to think about how do we attack this problem? How do we isolate portions of the landscape and then develop basically management strategies to derive the ecosystem services that we want to maintain? As I mentioned with the potential treatments, interactive drivers are probably going to be one of those solutions. Don't just pick one thing. Think about how do I layer on my stresses to negatively impact the plants? And then finally, the last big one is what you're all doing right now. You're at meetings to talk about why you love the Sandplain Grasslands and what you can do to maintain their integrity, what you can do to maintain the ecosystem services and benefits we derive from these. So continuing to support research, continuing to collect data, continuing to communicate about these issues is central to like understanding these systems and protecting them long term. Ultimately, we want to get back to maintaining these grassy landscapes. We want to get back to thinking about how do we keep these systems healthy? How do we keep the forage and the habitat available for a myriad of species? We also want to think about other ecosystem services. And in this picture of Kings Creek on Konza Prairie, there's quite a few woody plants in this environment. They would not have been there historically, but in a situation like this habitat is still open. We're still seeing a myriad of like positive ecosystem services. And so while this has changed, there's still many ecosystem benefits that are being provided. So it's a slight readjustment of how we view this landscape in terms of managing what is feasible and then making sure we're continuing to get the benefits out of this landscape that we desire. So with that, I've had a lot of colleagues who've helped me on this work that come from a variety of different locations. And so I've really appreciated their help over the years in terms of doing the things that we do. And then, of course, we're always supported by the Nature Conservancy and our federal funding partners at the NSF and the USDA. So with that, I'll stop my screen sharing. And I believe I have a few minutes left, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Terrific, Jesse. That just gets at so many of the questions that we are dealing with, except, we have pieces of landscapes rather than the whole landscapes that you're dealing with. But I think a lot of the lessons and a lot of the research is directly applicable. I think that probably resonated with everybody. So we do have some questions in the chat. I'm just going to call on those people to ask those questions. First is Charles, who had a question about whether woody encroachment could increase the water percolating down to aquifers. Charles, do you want to ask your question?
Actually, Chris, all the participants are not able to mute them. So if you just read the question to Jesse, he'll be able to answer it.
Oh, okay. Okay. So anyway, Charles asks, this is interesting. Is it possible that over a landscape scale, woody encroachment increases the water percolating to aquifers?
There has been some regions in the Edwards Plateau down in Texas. They've actually seen some instances where that has been the case. So it depends. In the area that we live, we are a karstic system. And one of the things we're seeing in areas that are woody encroached is we're actually seeing the hydrological cycle speed up. So we're seeing our streams drying. We're seeing that water drop out of the system, but it's moving below the alluvial aquifer. And so from there, where it goes, we're not exactly sure. So the line of thinking that you have there, I would agree with. There are some locations where potentially that water is moving deeper in the soil profile. And if there is an aquifer that is storing it, potentially it could be held down there, but it's going to be very case specific based on the underlying geology of the site.
But overall, evapotranspiration goes down. It goes up dramatically when you have all those woody plants because they're using water from different depths and using it all the time, right?
Yeah. So if you're just comparing two exact sizes of the landscape, the woody plants on average are using about 2.5 times more water than the grasses that they replace.
Yeah. All right. So Bob Werneriel has a question. He asked, what about original shrubs and subshrubs like lead plant, wild rose, prairie willows, and New Jersey tea? What role did those play and where are they now in your system?
Yeah, so we still have all of those species. They're common amongst our flora. Not all woody plants encroach. So one thing to keep in mind is that many woody plants are native in the ecosystem. Those we would call most of those subshrubs that you just mentioned, they all still exist on our landscape and their abundance has not changed over time. There are not one or two specific traits of some of these shrubs, like why some species become problems and others don't, is a very interesting ecological question that has yet to be answered. So we still have many of those we have many shrubs on the landscape that are not increasing in abundance and are not causing the problems that I was just communicating.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. All right. Next question. Have you looked at, this is from Karen Lombard, have you looked at what number of small grassland patches would maintain the regional biodiversity, even if you can't maintain the whole landscape? This is, I mean, our Sandplain grasslands are all in small patches. I mean, what you would call small patches and what we call we might call some of these large patches that you would call small. But so we worry about this question: how much grassland do we need to sustain the species, all the rarity and all the diversity that occurs in these? Have you thought about how much you would need in your landscape?
Yeah, I don't have an estimate of size, but most of the tallgrass prairie was lost, and throughout large portions of Iowa and Illinois and Missouri and Nebraska, the remnants only remain in very small patches. And so one of the things in communicating with the folks who are managing and maintaining these grasslands is trying to think of ways to document and to do everything that you can to keep these small patches intact. One of the great things about small patches is there tends to be a lot of eyeballs per square inch on the landscape compared to our really big landscapes. And so arguably in some of these smaller patches where we have very intentional management, it allows you to kind of stay on top of some of these problems a little bit more meaningfully compared to, like, let's say you're a rancher and you're trying to manage 2,000 acres, for just your herd. And so, like, being able to communicate both with folks who are working on the smaller patches and the larger ones for solutions tends to be our goal.
We still have a little bit of time for questions, right? I think we've got the next talk at 9:55. So I'm going to keep going with questions if you're willing, Jesse.
Sure.
So here's a question from Neil Gifford about fire. He asked, is all your fire dormant season fire, or is it mixed season depending on what you're after at a site?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for most of the Great Plains, fire can occur any time of year. It can be started by lightning any time of year. Historically, most of the fire happened in the spring. And so, indigenous peoples, as they start fire, basically the bison then would follow it. We call it kind of like a green wave. The bison were following basically the fire across the landscape. Conventionally, there aren't that many bison on the landscape now. They've been replaced by cattle, but it's the same thing. Burning in the spring results in our warm season grasses having the highest protein concentration, which then results in cattle putting on the most amount of weight. So that's when most of the fire has been happening here. At Konza and in other places, we do have burning in all 4 seasons. So in addition to fire frequency at Konza Prairie, we also have season of burn. One of the things that we've found, there's not a lot of difference between a fall burn and a winter burn. And if you're burning in the early spring, they all have pretty similar consequences. But one of the things that's gained a lot of traction for both this aspect of woody encroachment as well as promoting species diversity is actually burning in the summer. So in most grassy locations, even when the plants are or herbaceous species are green, you can get them to burn. And in those circumstances, the woody plants tend to be the most vulnerable in the summertime. And it tends to result actually in for us anyway, big boosts in biodiversity for some of the species that we don't normally see on the landscape. So we have been doing some of these varying season of year fires. Now, I will remind you that running a fire across your landscape on a 100-degree day in Kansas and all that smoke that gets produced, it's tough to convince people to do. That is a really awful environment, but we have actually seen quite a few positive benefits from doing a growing season fire. And so that's something that we've been looking at as well.
Yeah, that's something we think a lot about, but we're highly constrained in what we can do and when we can burn. Maybe one more question here from Jennifer Selfridge. Do you think differently about woody shrub acceptance? I thought that was a really fascinating concept. based on whether the species is a non-native invasive versus an aggressive native species. In other words, native species like native to North America, like juniper, eastern red cedar, are extremely aggressive. How do you think about those two classes of plants?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is a level of nuance there. One of the things, like for my talk today, when I've been talking about woody plant encroachment, I've been talking about woody plant encroachment in very like large terms and almost exclusive related to native plants. These woody plants are native that I was speaking about today. Roughleaf dogwood, eastern red cedar, smooth sumac. These are natives. We do have really problematic non-native ones. That'd be like Callery pear or Bradford pear here in the middle portion of the country. It's just a disaster. So your treatment plans are probably going to vary. The consequences, though, of replacement by Callery pear or replacement by eastern red cedar tend to be about the same. They both end up having quite negative consequences. And the distinction about being native or non-native isn't tied into the reduction in ecosystem services. They both have equivalent negative effects when they become in high abundance.
So I'm going to ask you one more question. We have one more question from Betsy Von Holly, whom you may know. So can you speak about the types of management actions that have worked to maintain grasslands at small scales?
Yes. So I work a lot with the Missouri Prairie Foundation. Missouri lost all of its big landscapes. And so we work a lot on trying to keep woody plants out and maintain biodiversity. And so a lot of what they're doing is trying to keep fire in some capacity on the landscape when it's safe and when it can be managed effectively. And then they do a lot of mechanical or by hand removal. And then they do a lot of very targeted, like isolated spraying. So not from airplanes, not broadcast, like very targeted spraying. And they've seen a lot of positive outcomes. And so in these smaller landscapes where you can be very intentional, and you can set up treatment plans where you're checking things in with a lot of frequency, maybe 2, 3 times a year, you're checking and see the success of things. That's where we've seen some of our like most positive outcome.
Yeah, right. Jesse, fabulous. Thank you very much. That hit the nail on the head for a lot of things that we're thinking about. Thanks for all the great work and for getting up early to talk to us. And now I put the Konza Prairie address in the chat, and people can look at all the marvelous work that's gone on there. Jesse, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Let's give Jesse a big hand.
Thanks.
All right. All right. Wow, that was a great kickoff. All right. Next up, we have a series of talks based on local grasslands here. Our first one is by Sarah Boyce. Sarah's Director of Research and Conservation at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation on Nantucket, and she'll be talking about black pine management to restore sandplain grasslands. Sarah. Sarah, you have to unmute you. Can we unmute Sarah, Eric?
Got it. Can you see my screen?
Yep, that's good.
I got remuted.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, tough act to follow, everyone, but hopefully you can take away some of the work that we've been doing as an example of some of the principles that Jesse spoke about. So let's get right into it. Advance. Go. There. So the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, where I am Director of Research and Conservation, is a small land trust on the western side of Nantucket Island off the coast of Massachusetts. We have 275 acres of diverse habitat types. We're open for passive recreation, and a little more than 50% of our overall habitat, as you see in this map, is a mix of sandplain grassland and heathland community. So everything in green in this map. And as we work to protect what we already have and potentially expand some of those species within that habitat type. One of the battles we've been facing is a non-native invasive species, which does happen to be a woody plant, which is Japanese black pine. So of course, there are other threats to these systems, but this is what my focus is for today. So Japanese black pine was first planted on Nantucket around the 1800s. We don't know the exact invasion history for our property, but expecting that it was planted sometime in the early 1900s to maybe 1950. It's was planted typically as a windbreak. And so that is actually something that we now see ecologically as a negative, blocking that natural wind and salt spray. It's a known grassland invader. It likes nutrient-poor sandy soils. It can be a fire hazard, and it's also a known secondary host for southern pine beetle, which is another threat that we've been battling on the island. And there's lots more to talk about for Japanese black pine, but let's just get into our management. So this is another map of our property, and everything in this light green is that, once again, Sandplain Grassland coastal heathland mix that was originally mapped in the early 2000s by the Nature Conservancy. And then everything overlaid in this light turquoise color, whether it's a triangle or a polygon, were mapped populations of Japanese black pine pre-2018. So what you can immediately see is there's a lot of overlap. And then we calculated that it's about a 20% of the Sandplain grassland habitat was occupied in some way, whether individual trees or larger stands of Japanese black pine. And so and if you look to the north or the top of the slide, you can see the ocean. And we know that some of the prevailing winds, the northeast winds, have really shaped a lot of this landscape over time, and that's been a regular disturbance that has helped the Sandplain grassland habitat over time and shaped it, this regular disturbance for this early successional habitat. And what we're seeing is this is the grassland heathland mix in the foreground, and in the background is a lot of Japanese black pine that functions as a wall blocking all this wind and salt spray. And so over time, starting in 2018, we undertook managing the stands over time, as I said. And this is still ongoing, but we've been kind of taking out bigger and bigger chunks over time. And as a small organization, it was a way to take one problematic species and have a bigger impact to Sandplain grassland preservation and overall increasing biodiversity. And so the goal, once again, partly just first of all, to remove a non-native invasive species, to restore those natural wind and salt spray regimes, spur native habitat recovery, and then reduce those fire risks. You can see some of these mature stands from before management. There's a lot of standing dead and fallen slash that's just creating a real fire hazard on these very dry landscapes. And because for this talk, I thought you also might be interested in how we funded these projects over time. And of course, to acknowledge our funders, we had 2 different rounds of our state wildlife habitat management grant program. We had some private funding from the Schumann Foundation, which really focused on restoration of grassland bird habitat. And then we had funding for multiple years of management from the RCN project that many of you on the call or on the meeting were part of as well, the Xeric Habitat Conservation Program, which really focused on pollinator diversity, specifically bees and moths. And so this was, thinking about Jesse's talk, this was a mechanical removal. We used chainsaws, our contractors did. We had chainsaws, we had skid steers. Everything was chipped on site and then removed. We did not remove the stumps because the Japanese black pine we found was not resprouting aggressively, and this allowed our grant funding to go a little bit further. And then we did not add any additional materials in areas where the Japanese black pine had been removed, and we wanted to monitor natural regrowth. And then subsequently, needle thatch layer that wasn't removed initially, additional pine cones, and sprouts that were missed the first time were followed up removal by volunteers and staff over time. And we monitored in many different ways. And I appreciate what Jesse was saying with adaptive management. When we try new things or as conditions change, we need to monitor in many different ways so we understand success. And when I say success, it's what your organizational goals are. So we took photo points, and we continue to take photo points of many of our areas. It's kind of the quick and dirty, cheapest way to do that. We took a lot of vegetation transects early on as a proof of concept for us. And then we took visual surveys for both rare species and then any non-native invasives that were coming in the disturbed areas. We did acoustic surveys for bird diversity, and then we conducted bee cup samples and netting for pollinator diversity. I'm only going to talk about mainly the plant results for now, but if you're interested, there is the Barton et al. Paper that talks about the results of the pollinator study. So for photo monitoring, which is also the most fun thing to be able to show to funders and to monitor over time visually, you can see in this pre-management picture from 2018, once again, a lot of standing dead, but you can see the grassland habitat generally in and among the black pine stand. Immediately post-management, you can see the stumps in the foreground. You can see our native pitch pines that are dotted in the background, which we are conserving. And then you can see a rain gauge in the back as a point of reference. So then this is the first growing season after management, where you can still see those stumps and you can see the rain gauge in the background. But you can just visually see graminoids, forbs, and potentially some low-growing shrubs coming in. So it's really recovering. And then that was in 2018. This is from just this past November 2025. Just visually, you can see that there is still a low growth vegetation diversity of plants in the mix. Over time, our photo monitoring techniques have improved, but this is another larger stand that we removed in 2022. And so this is pre-management. You can see the dense vegetation, or the dense stand rather, of Japanese black pine. Immediately or within that first winter, you can see there's a lot more detritus left on the ground, woody debris. To Jesse's point, having skid steers and big trucks and everything did cause some soil disturbance, but I'll point out in a minute why that was actually a benefit for us. This is the first growing season after management. You can see there's still some open pockets of non-vegetated land. Second growing season really filled in, and then third growing season, so just this past August. And I will say we were in a significant drought at this time, so take that visual representation with a grain of salt. In addition, we took vegetation transects, as I said, for all of the stands that were removed in 2018. So this is just a compilation of the data for those areas that were managed in 2018. And this is just a stacked plot looking at the functional groups of forbs, graminoids, and woody plants. All of these are actually native species. Any of the non-natives that started coming in were small sprouts that we immediately pulled. So this is just showing that basically what I want you to note is that over time, first of all, there's an overall increase in vegetation cover. So the vegetation is naturally filling in and recovering. You can see because it's over 100% cover, there is height variation in the cover that we're measuring. We have a general stasis of graminoid cover, which is the most dominant. There's increase of forbs and then a reduction of forbs, but what we've been seeing over time is an overall increase of woody cover, as kind of mirroring what Jesse was saying. We revisited these transects in 2024, and we have seen an increase in that woody cover. And so this is when we look at as an adaptive management project, maybe this is where there's an initial or another intervention potentially needed. But basically what this data points to is taking a deeper look at what our goals are in these particular areas and what management tactics we want to take for reducing that woody cover further. We also looked at diversity. 2020, we had some limited data, which is why there's that little dip. But basically, we've seen that increase in overall diversity over time for these same transects. And so that is a positive benefit to us. And just to show you what some of those dominant species are, I'm just going to show you pictures of for each of those functional groups, what those real dominants are. And of course, for everyone in the Northeast that works in these habitats, no one will be surprised by these dominant grasses. Carex pennsylvanica is by far the most dominant. We had other Carex species as well, but we're in much more limited occurrences. We had little blue stem grass and Danthonia. Let's see. For forbs, we had euthymia was our most dominant, and then a lot of other forbs came in at lower percentages. So there was a higher diversity of overall or a higher richness of overall forbs, but our asters were really dominant with some goats rue in the mix. And then our woody shrubs, this is what I really wanted to get hit home, were our typical ericaceous shrub species of the heathland. So typical native plants that we want as part of this diversity mix, but it's really the clonal plants, like Jesse was saying, of huckleberry that are becoming the most dominant. And so that's something that we'll have to, as an organization, and what are our goals for these plots if we want to manage these huckleberry plants in a different way as they continue to dominate and potentially crowd out other species. The other way we looked at vegetation, we're specifically targeting rare species. So this is another management site on the plot that we actually managed, in 2023. So before management in 2022, we looked at all the occurrences of Scissorhynchium fuscatum, or sandplain blue-eyed grass, the species of special concern in Massachusetts, and one of the species of greatest conservation need. And so all these little purple dots are occurrences of sandplain blue-eyed grass before management, and you can see the extent of the pines in that area. That turquoise polygon is what the scope of work is, where all the tractors, or not tractors, the skid steers and all the management action was in that site. The second year or second growing season, you can see the Scissorhynchium fuscatum populations. And then again, just this past year in 2025, you can see that basically the Scissorhynchium fuscatum is now visible, proliferating, occurring in areas where basically it was like the edges of the Japanese black pine populations. And now we recognize that these didn't, spontaneously come in or necessarily recruit after management. Our assumption is that these were in the soil already in the seed bank, and that it was that disturbance, actually what Jesse was alluding to, of the skid steers coming in, the dump trucks that came in, and there was that soil disturbance, plus the opening up of the canopy that allowed these species to come in. And I'm not going to go into our grassland bird data, but basically what we were seeing, there wasn't a difference in species for other parts of the property in the grasslands. But what we did note was that the use of the former pine areas that are now recovering as grasslands and heathlands, they are being occupied by grassland requiring bird species. So whether they're nesting or hunting, like the northern harrier, killdeers, and eastern towhees are all using these habitats that were formerly Japanese black pine stands. So just to follow up or to summarize, since 2018, we've removed about 25 acres of solid Japanese black pine stands, but because of restoring that natural wind and salt spray regime and kind of removing that wall of pines, we feel that we've effectively restored 150 acres that is getting that natural disturbance regime again. We are restoring that Sandplain grassland habitat, increasing biodiversity, and really using this as an adaptive management tool to look at what are our next steps for management. We further reduced the fire risk and the fuel load by removing those dead pine stands, and then also reduced the further potential for southern pine beetle infestation. And just to remember, we went from this to this in many of our areas. It's been also a very positive impact to people who use our trails. And so that's also helpful. And I just want to thank everyone who helped participate over the years in data collection and management. And with that, I hope I might have time for some questions.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, just to stay on time, we're going to hold questions until the break at 10:45, if that's okay, and we'll go right into our next talk, which is going to be Neil. So please hold on to your questions, and we'll get to them. All right, our next presentation is by Neil Gifford. Neil is the conservation director at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve near Albany, New York. And he's been instrumental in managing that preserve for a long time. His talk is entitled, "Whoa, Didn't See That Coming, Unexpected Outcomes from an Inland Pine Barrens Restoration." So, Neil.
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself. Gotta love
Yeah, put
Zoom.
it in full screen mode, Neil.
Yep. Oh man. There we go from beginning. How about now?
We're still seeing perfect.
Okay.
You got it. All
Sorry
right,
about
take it
that.
away.
Thanks, Chris, for that great introduction. And I'm gonna get right into it. Yeah, so this presentation is a little bit different from ones that you've seen me present in the past. I just wanted to focus on some of the surprises. Alex Saldo will speak later about some of our other work. For those of you not familiar with the Albany pine bush, the Albany pine bush is one of the best remaining global examples of an inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens. In its best form, we've realized that it's kind of this grassy shrubland or a shrubby grassland underneath this open canopied habitat of pitch pine and scattered oak trees. It is also the type locality for the endangered cardinal blue butterfly. And it supports, like all pine barrens, a really rich biodiversity. There are 114 S1 to S3 wildlife from the site, half a dozen rare plants. It's a national natural landmark because it sits on this massive field of parabolic sand dunes and has a bunch of other accolades like important bird area, bird conservation area. But the Albany pine bush is really just one of about 20 pitch pine scrub oak barrens left in the Northeast, all of which are biodiversity hotspots and also have in common that they're all have been pretty degraded. They've been reduced in size and, of course, fire suppressed. So if we're going to manage and maintain all of this globally rare and regionally rare biodiversity, they are truly conservation reliant. The other thing they all have in common is that there really is no reference community for pitch pine scrub oak barrens that we can use to guide our work. And that comes into play in particular with understanding and monitoring the rare wildlife and letting them tell us if we're moving things in the right direction. The Albany pine bush itself originally covered about 25 to 50,000 acres. There are fewer than 6,000 acres of open space left in that landscape and about 3,000 acres protected in the preserve. So jumping to the first, whoa, didn't see that coming. We have been managing the project started as a TNC project we started managing with fire in 91. And we had 8 years into our program, we had a small escape where a 7-acre prescribed fire became a 65-acre wildfire. Obviously, didn't see that coming. The fire and smoke behavior was also unexpected. But the real woe with this whole situation, with this escape, was what we learned as a result of it. And as a result of that escape, we ended up experimenting with mechanical pretreatments and growing season fire and learned an awful lot. Out of the gate, realized that these mechanical pretreatments and followed by growing season fire results in dramatically different fire behavior and fire effects, both as a result of rearranging the fuels, but also as a result of the seasonal differences of burning during the growing season and setting back those woody plants. So we had phenomenal fire and smoke behavior with these growing season fires and a really good response from the site. Importantly, we changed the structural components of the barrens in an important way, reducing shrub cover, increasing grass and forbs, and more importantly, eliminating decades of litter and duff and exposing mineral soil compared to the mow only. But importantly, we didn't see any significant changes in plant species composition, which is something we were worried about. And all of that led to a pretty dramatic paradigm shift for us in being able to go from an 8-week dormant season prescribed fire window to a year-round fire window that has enabled us to finally start managing at the appropriate scale. We've managed about 4,700 acres total, about a 2,000 acre footprint since 1991. But importantly, at a minimum, any given pine barren site should receive fire at least once every 10 years, if not more frequently. And that's indeed what we've been able to actually do. And now we're burning a little more than 10% of the preserve a year, which was one of our goals. That has also facilitated a pretty dramatic response in the plant community. Lupin expansion, when I was a seasonal in 94, 95, sampling all of our Carner sites, so we had maybe, 13 acres. About 4 hectares. Today, there are over 300 hectares of lupin in the preserve. Lupin does not seed bank, so this is a result of us seeding it, but we couldn't have seeded it had we not done those mechanical pretreatments followed by growing season fire. That was really a game changer. And if you put lupin seed directly into the black, it just explodes. And as Jesse alluded to earlier, the impact that has on forage quality for all these herbivores in particular the rare insects, was really dramatic. New Jersey tea, we did not expect to see the response of this plant that we got. Important for all kinds of native pollinators, but in particular the mottled dusky-winged skipper, which feeds on nothing else as a caterpillar. I should mention lupin's important for carners and elfins as their sole food source. We are finally getting great pitch pine recruitment, in some cases too much, but in the past with only dormant season fire and not eliminating litter and duff, we had no pitch pine recruitment. And we've seen other rare plants reemerge. Virginia marbleseed was thought to have been extirpated from upstate New York. It had been absent, not seen in the preserve for 100 years. May have always been there, just hadn't seen it. But that plant is now known in the preserve in some of the areas we're managing the hardest. The surprise with Carner recovery was pretty dramatic too. The surprise was not that we recovered them. I always hoped we would do that and expect that was an expected outcome. But the speed with which we were able to recover the Carners was really kind of alarming and surprising to me. We went from a few hundred animals, fewer than 1,000 in 2007. In 4 years, we broke through the 3,000 butterfly federal recovery threshold and have maintained the Carner population above 3,000 for the last 13 years. And these numbers are really conservative because we're only sampling about 10% of the habitat we know they're in. And as Alex will talk about later, the response to the frosted elfin, New York State threatened, and a federal candidate species was also pretty dramatic. One of the things we were concerned about were southern pine beetle, and working with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's Forest Health Lab, we know we've had southern pine beetle in the preserve, and the DEC is sampling around a number of sites around the state. And they were really surprised with how robust our native bark beetle community is and how important that is in helping suppress and check southern pine beetle. We have incredibly large, robust populations of both competitors, native competitors and predators to southern pine beetle, which is itself a native insect that's moving north as a result of climate change. So that was a great surprise. What we really didn't see coming, and neither did DEC, they literally came knocking on my door one day. They found a pretty healthy population and continue to find this animal, previously only known from Long Island, thought to have been extirpated from New York State. And this native longhorn beetle is a pine barren specialist and seems to be doing quite well in the places that we're managing pretty intensively with fire. It's not just about insects. Birds, too, have responded well, as Sarah alluded to with her project. And for us, the biggest surprise was whippoorwills. Whippoorwills were gone from this landscape for at least 30 years. They are now actively occupying and have a growing breeding season population in the areas we're actively managing, to the point where it's not all that difficult for us to go out and catch and tag them and track their movements with GPS. And we're finding that they're using the managed preserve lands pretty intensively. And this is ongoing work that we certainly look forward to publishing. The commission was also part of the regional conservation need xeric pollinator project that Sarah had mentioned. And what we were surprised with this whole project, here we are comparing the pine bush to some 20 other sites, 19 other sites, and the species richness and abundances of native moths and native bees in the preserve was really outstanding. When you consider its small size inside a heavily fragmented urban landscape, that was a very nice surprise. More than 200 species of native bees. But as a result of that project, we also had 2 species previously believed to be extirpated rediscovered, the wax sallow moth and Henry's elfin. The other outcome we didn't really see coming was that it's counterintuitive to think that thinning the host plant for a rare insect could actually bolster its population. But by thinning scrub oak, which is the sole host plant for the inland barrens buck moth, we actually improved pupation sites, and the population has actually maintained itself at relatively high levels, despite us thinning the scrub oak, its host plant, by nearly 50% in the barrens. But the last biggest surprise of all is just how much time flies when you're having fun. This is me from my second field season in 1995 as a seasonal tech, working on a little power line strip, trying to get some lupin to grow. Here we are in 1998, and today there we are earlier this week in 2026, and it is surprising to see not just, obviously we're all still there, a little bit balder, a little bit heavier, but for some of us, but to see the changes in the landscape. And for those of you familiar with the Albany pine bush that have been coming there for decades, you'll recognize that the landscape has really been transformed, not just at small individual sites, but at large. we now have a much more healthy, functioning, resilient pitch pine scrub oak barrens, and we know that because of the responses of the plants and animals to our ongoing management. And I just want to close with this idea that species need systems, not just habitat. And that by taking an ecosystem-based approach, you can produce expected and unexpected positive outcomes. And with that, I will say thank you and hand it back to you, Chris. How did I do
Thank
on
you,
time?
Neil. Yep, no, we're right on time. So if there's I don't see a specific question in the chat. Lots of accolades for all the work you've been doing there.
Well,
But
thank you.
I don't see any specific questions. So we can. Well, I think we'll just to basically stay on schedule here. We'll
Okay.
hand these minutes to Jake, and maybe we'll get some questions at the very
Right.
end.
Thank you.
So thanks. Yeah. So our next talk is by Jake McCumber. Jake is the Natural Resources and Training's Lands Manager at the Mass Army National Guard, responsible for management at Camp Edwards on the upper part of Cape Cod. And his talk is entitled Keeping the Sand in the Sandplains. Bare sand plays a key role in supporting biodiversity. So, Jake.
All right, good morning, everybody. Man, those were some really excellent talks that actually paved the way pretty nicely for my topic. So, since we were focusing on biodiversity in our Sandplain Grasslands for today, I wanted to focus on maybe what seems like a bit of a myopic part of it, but what I've found to be really incredibly important to maintaining or increasing our biodiversity in our grasslands, and that's having a diversity of bare sandy patches and kind of mimicking the past historic disturbance processes that would have kept these exposed soil areas for seeds to take hold, for a wide array of fauna that needs these openings. So as managers, we have all this complexity that can be a bit overwhelming at times. That's why I've got the photo of the space shuttle control area there, because it can be so challenging to try to manage for this whole system, this complex of natural communities in these isolated patches that we have. And we're trying to track the different types of management, the scale we're going to be managing at, the timing, mixing up those regimes so that we can maintain diversity and not just have static landscapes out there. And we're focusing on the different components of the community, the different structure. And so really, I just wanted to focus today on that one aspect, reminding folks to incorporate keeping bare sand in your grasslands, to intentionally prioritize that in your planning for your restoration work, because it is that key driver of our biodiversity and a core part of our grasslands environments and our broader pine barrens environments. So when you're developing the scopes of work or your restoration plans, I encourage you to prioritize having those plots of bare sand and having them in a diversity of composition. You know, this two-track road here through part of our grasslands where you can see that woody encroachment happening with that bare sand, even on this road, is a great support for frosted elfin butterflies, some of our rare plants, purple tiger beetles, and so much more. So then the trick of this bare sand really gets into how we maintain it. And if we just drive on this sandy road to keep it a sandy road, there's a lot of compaction with that. So we have to be thoughtful about the timing and intensity of that use, maybe incorporating other tools. I've wanted to start trying chain drag harrows. We haven't gotten into that. So if anybody has been doing that in their sandplain habitats, please send me a message after this and I'd love to talk to you about it. But if you're doing those forestry projects like Sarah described, I really have been a big fan of skid roads, and I encourage other folks to use those skid roads, intensifying some of that disturbance so you're exposing that bare sand really reaps a lot of rewards quickly, excuse me, for some of our species of greatest conservation need plants, but also a lot of wildlife. And then again, focusing on maintaining it with fire, with some amount of driving, dragging. I'm a big fan of burn piles because you get that intensity in that one spot, so that creates a lot of that patchy diversity in the structure. So I'm just going to run through. I don't have the monitoring data in this that the last two talks provided, but so they were a good setup for this. But just going over a little bit of that diversity that the bare sand provides. Ground nesting bees is a really obvious set of species that depends on that open bare sand for their burrows. And like Neil said, they've got over 200 species of bee at Albany Pine Bush. The same is true at Montague. I think they documented over 250 species post restoration work out there, which is really incredible. And a majority of those species are depending on that bare soil substrate for their burrows. And then there's uh, the parasitic species that are native parasitic bees that are actually using those same burrows and these complex ecological interactions. But then there's bees out there maintaining some of our rare or special plants of the sand plains, like the bumblebee on the dwarf prairie willow, or I have that sweat bee pollinating Agellinus acuta. And Walsh's digger bee is one of our focal species. The only population east of the Ohio River of Walsh's digger bee is located on Camp Edwards down through Crane Wildlife Management Area and on Martha's Vineyard. So incredibly isolated and highly dependent on a high degree of exposed sand within sandplain grassland habitat. Moths and butterflies, it's pretty similar. They're not creating these complex burrows underground, but many of the host plants truly depend on having exposed sand as a key part of the matrix in the sandplain grasslands for those species to seed and take root. One interesting finding we had with research we're doing on frosted elfin butterflies right now is that the adults are preferentially using the sandy openings, whether it is the two-track roads or more openings more within the matrix. They're preferentially using those for lucking sites, for breeding behavior, movement corridors, and the majority of our adult observations, despite transects through all the habitat, weren't out in the denser wild indigo and blue stem areas. They were around these sandy openings. So they play a key role for a lot of behaviors of many of these lepidopterans. And species that are incredibly rare, like this Pelocrysta argentifurcatana up at the top right, there's fewer than 20 observations of that species in the northeastern United States. The majority of them are at Camp Edwards, and they're all within these little sandy openings within the sandplain habitats. And tiger beetles are a really obvious one, but in southern New England, we have several species of very rare tiger beetle, many of which have incredibly isolated populations, and they're tied really closely to these sandplain grassland habitats, and within those, truly isolated to these sandy openings and the variety of sandy openings. So while they will use these two-track roads, they really seem to prefer the more complex and variable openings embedded within the grasslands. Endemic plants are very much the same way. So sickle-leaf golden aster or Pityopsis falcata is exclusively found in the North Atlantic coastal pine barrens remnants. And this species truly depends on having these sandy blowout openings that it would have evolved with. And so we have to make sure that we're providing these and maintaining these throughout the landscape if we want to keep these key endemic elements of our ecosystem and these sandplain grasslands. And the pine barrens, golden heather, and similar species have these same dependencies where they can have incredibly high populations where these sandy areas occur, but as soon as you lose that exposed sand, they disappear. And many of our other rare plants are in the same boat. So some of our state endangered and state watch list plants really depend on these more sparse sandy openings within the sandplain habitats. The overall ecosystem resilience even depends on making sure we continue this dynamic patchwork of disturbance exposing the sand. Again, that's what it would have evolved with. And places where they've found that they completely lack pitch pine regeneration, we were encouraging them, make sure you're exposing the sand. And luckily, Kathleen Stutzman completed some great research recently looking at what was necessary to promote pitch pine regeneration in the pine barrens. So she was looking at forestry and fire, and what she really found was that you have to expose that sand, and it's a natural part of the process. If we want to maintain the pine barrens, our plant and wildlife diversity, we need to have these sandy openings. So how to promote that, create it, and maintain it? Luckily, it's not anything too outside of our normal toolbox. Uh, any mechanical disturbance will do it fairly well. In some of our areas where we were losing sandy openings to woody encroachment, we've had really good luck just physically pulling out the pitch pines and other woody plants. We pile them up and burn them. And as I said before, then those burn piles really add to the mosaic of that landscape because that intensity keeps the encroachment out for longer. You get this incredibly robust response, like Sarah showed in her photos, or this one here. That's just a year after the management that we did to open up this site. And the wild indigo, the little blue stem, it fills in so wonderfully. But you need something to keep some of that out, so you've got that diversity of patchiness in there. And the wildlife responds just as fast as the plants. Within that year, we had Walsh's digger bee actively nesting in this restored sandy opening. And as I mentioned, there's so many other tools to keep that vegetation out of there or to create these new patches. And it's not novel, so it's just prioritizing it in your management because keeping the sand in the sand plains, as I say here, is a key driver of that biodiversity. Those species that I went through in there, they've all evolved with this incredibly dynamic environment that's constantly resetting in a dynamic, patchy way. So exposing that sand is a real benefit. And we have to watch out for invasive plants and other negative potential impacts with that. But if we provide it, the biodiversity will be our reward. So thank you.
Thank you, Jake. So we have time for a couple of questions, and I'm trying to summarize a couple of them here. One of the questions from Steve about coming from a perspective of Long Island, a place with a lot of organic matter buildup covering a lot of sandy openings. To what extent can burning be used to expose sandy soil again? And is there any data on that?
I don't have any specific data. I know there's plenty out there, and that relates a little bit to all three talks before this. The fire plays an essential role in there, and we actually see if we have a good intense fire, we've got a good fire regime in our grasslands, so we're generally exposing sand in that interstitial space between the bunch grasses and things like that. So we'll actually immediately post fire, the tiger beetles will move into those broad areas because they've got sand to run around, they've got good hunting conditions, things like that. But within that first growing season, you lose a lot of that exposed sand. So fire plays a good role, but with all the plants really adapted to the fire, it fills back in really quickly. So you want some areas where you're actually keeping the sand more exposed. You're pushing that out a little bit. It's just part of that patchy diversity because if it all fills in with canopy cover, even if that canopy cover is just grass and forbs, you're going to lose a lot of the ground nesting bees and tiger beetles and things like that. So fire is a part of it, but you want some physical disturbance too.
So how do you deal with non-native species coming into those areas? Do you see that a lot? And how do you deal with it when you do see it?
It's site and plant specific, so we do see that for sure. In some of our smaller woodland opening patches that we're maintaining as little satellites of Sandplain Grassland, we're going in and just hand pulling invasive plants out of there a lot of times. In the broader grasslands, a lot of it's cut and paint so that we're not broadly spraying around in there, and that works pretty well. So it's keeping an eye on it and using the right tool to keep the invasives at bay.
We have a question from Jennifer about burn piles. Her question is, do you have issues with animals using them for shelter, and how do you avoid harming them if you do? And how do you address that concern?
We've not really noticed that that I'm aware of. Part of that would be trying to get to it in a relatively timely fashion. You've got to let things cure out a bit, but you don't want to leave it as a dominant habitat feature for terribly long, unless that's something you're really working towards. And any of this management, I think any of us who are doing it, we know that there are some indirect take impacts from the types of management. So if there is something in that brush pile, that's not ideal. I would go in with some disturbance. Usually you're going to be working around there before you burn it. So if it's birds and stuff like that, they're going to move out. You're not going to burn the burn piles during nesting season. So, make sure that you're trying to get the critters out of there if there is something using it. That's
So one person is asking here about lichen diversity. That also could benefit from these bare patches. Have you or anybody worked on that? I haven't personally heard of anybody working on that in these landscapes.
We haven't. No, I don't know. But you do see some complex lichen in these bare openings for sure.
All right, Jake, thank you. Excellent
welcome.
talk. All right, we're going to move on to our last talk before the morning break, before the morning additional discussion and break. And that's a talk by Karen Beatty. Karen is Vice President of Science and Stewardship at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation out on Nantucket. And she's talking about forest understory regeneration following southern pine beetle suppression management on Nantucket. Karen.
Chris?
Karen, we still can't hear you. We need you unmuted somehow.
It might be in her headset.
I don't know. I'm not seeing her. I should go to the meeting.
If we wanted to go
Yeah,
to
Karen, we're not hearing you at all. Sorry about that.
He's going to try it without the headset.
Just try it. Yeah, try without the headset.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
works. Very good.
Awesome. Sorry
Okay.
about that. I hope I can
No, we're
deduct
still on.
my technological problems from my 5 minutes. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see your screen just fine. Take it away.
Okay, great. Sorry about that, everybody. So this is the first lightning talk of the conference today, so please bear with me as I try to squeeze a lot of pictures and a lot of information into 5 minutes or less. But I wanted to share some insights into forest understory regeneration following southern pine beetle suppression management on Nantucket Island that was undertaken by the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, who I work for. And if you're not familiar with NCF, we are a private nonprofit land trust on Nantucket that owns about 9,000 acres or 1/3 of the island. Okay, now I'm having trouble advancing my screen.
Click on it again with your mouse.
I'm trying. Not having a good day technology-wise here.
Karen, do you want me to try putting up?
There we go. Got it.
There we go. There we go.
Okay.
So hopefully the southern pine beetle is a beetle that's familiar to most of you. It is a species that is native to the southeastern United States that has been expanding its range to the north. And down in the southern states, it's done a tremendous amount of damage, causing billions of dollars in losses in the timber industry. It has been expanding its range to the north due to climate change impacts and warming temperatures in the winter. So in 2014, there was a large outbreak on Long Island, New York, and that has continued to cause a lot of damage down there. So we have been expecting to see southern pine beetle moving its way into the New England area for quite some time. We've been doing monitoring for southern pine beetle in Massachusetts starting in 2015 using funnel traps and pheromone lures, and picked up small numbers of beetles up until 2022 and 2023 when we started to see some really big upticks in captures, particularly on Nantucket Island and Martha's Vineyard as well. So in July of 2023, our wildlife research ecologist Danielle Odell detected the first outbreak of southern pine beetle on Nantucket in a 13-acre pitch pine stand in the southwestern portion of the island. And this was about the same time as we started seeing an outbreak on Martha's Vineyard. So just to give you an idea of how quickly a southern pine beetle infestation can advance, these two drone photos are taken about a month apart. And you can see on the left, this was taken right after we detected the outbreak. And then the picture on the right was a mere 4 weeks later. So these beetles reproduce very quickly and cause mortality very, very quickly. We were limited in our ability to respond to this outbreak immediately because the site is a known maternity roost site for northern long-eared bats, which are federally endangered species. So we had to wait until the fall to do any management work here. So we worked with Mass DCR and Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program to come up with a forest cutting plan and a forest stewardship plan for this site. Had to do that really, really quickly. And the first step that we undertook was understory clearing. This site was previously unmanaged, and the understory of the forest was very, very dense and thick, which may have contributed to the fact that the infestation happened to begin with. So we did understory clearing to increase sight lines and improve safety and allow equipment access to take trees down. Second step was that we cut all the infested trees and then a buffer of trees surrounding the trees that were infested. And in total, we took down a total of 235 pitch pine trees, some of which were very, very old. And then step 3 was cleanup in the winter of 2023 and 2024, which involved chipping and removing the slash and the tree boles that were taken down in the fall. We did wind up leaving quite a bit of woody debris on the ground, but we tried to remove as much of it as possible and expose bare ground and mineral soil to promote regeneration of the understory. And this is just a couple pictures showing what it looked like post-suppression in October of 2023 and then post-cleanup in 2024, the spring of 2024. So once we did all of this very intense management work, we were left with what are we going to do at this site in terms of restoration and recovery following this management, which I will say was very destructive management, and it's management that none of us here at NCF contemplated ever having to do on one of our pieces of property. So we decided that what we wanted to do was really just kind of sit back and see what came back from the seed bank rather than try to turn it into a particular habitat, and made a decision to monitor and only intervene if we saw non-native invasive species coming in. So Kelly Almond, who is our botanist and plant ecologist here at NCF, you're going to hear from her later. She did a plant survey of the site in 2024, and I know you can't read all of these tiny little names, but what she found was that of the 44 species she documented in this site, 17 of them, or about 40%, were Sandplain Grassland associated species. So we were really excited to see that. And then we did have some invasives, particularly honeysuckle, but not a tremendous amount of invasives. So I just want to quickly walk you through some pictures showing how the site has recovered over 2 growing seasons. These are photo monitoring points, all taken from the same vantage. The first year after the first year of the growing season, we saw a big influx of herbaceous species and grabenoid species. And then in the following year, we started to see more shrubs coming in, most of which were native, which was really encouraging. So just kind of take home message and silver linings, we will be continuing to monitor the site. And if we see invasives starting to come in, we will intervene, but we're looking forward to seeing how the site responds going forward. And I think it's just important to recognize that some of these southern pine beetle suppression sites, although this type of management is extremely destructive, it's necessary and it can provide opportunities for Sandplain grassland species establishment. Again, monitoring and management for invasives is important whenever you do anything that disturbs soil, as with any restoration project. And then some of the other unexpected benefits that, we look as a win is decreased fire risk and increasing habitat resilience. And then we also noted that we really improved habitat for woodpeckers and things, other cavity nesting birds. And that's all I have for now. Just want to say thank you to a number of people, and I'd be happy to take questions if I have time.
Thank you, Karen. So we do have a couple of questions. Let's see. So can you talk about a little bit about the costs of doing this? Where are the major costs? What are the constraints on getting somebody on this quickly, right? Because it is my understanding that quick response, and you alluded to this, is critical, right? If you're going to preserve some of those pitch pines and lower the density, you've got to, and before trees die after an infestation, you've got to get on it really quickly. So what were some of those factors that you were dealing with?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We were able to apply for grant funding to partially cover the work that we did, but it was kind of a fire drill. As I mentioned, we were expecting southern pine beetle to show up, but I think we all hoped we were going to have a couple more years to kind of prepare for it. And it is very, very expensive. I would say that it's probably more expensive here than it is in most places because there are just a limited number of contractors on an island 30 miles out at sea that have the type of equipment and the expertise to do this kind of work. We do have an in-house land management crew of 7 people, but none of them were very extensively trained in chainsaw work, so we did have to contract that work out. And one of the things we're doing as we play catch up here and think about forest management, both reactive and proactive, is we're doing a lot more chainsaw training in-house and trying to build up the expertise within our department to take on some of this work, to obviously lower the costs, but it's dangerous and it needs to be done safely, so that takes time.
So follow-up question from Andrew here at Maine Coast Heritage Trust is, so are there plans, or are you thinking about using prescribed fire in combination with some of these clearing efforts? And is that part of the thinking either on Nantucket or elsewhere? And if other people are thinking about that, putting that in the chat, I think would be useful.
Yeah, that's I wish that we were able to do prescribed burning within our organization. We used to have a burn program, but we did have an escape fire, and it's very challenging to do, as everybody on this call knows, it's very challenging to have the right conditions to do prescribed fire anywhere. But here in particular, we've just seen much more extreme weather conditions as a result of climate change. One of the major things that impacts us in our ability to do fire here on Nantucket is wind. We are usually very, very often out of prescription when it comes to wind. And then it's very expensive if you don't have the crew here on the island to bring them over to do a burn. And then you come over on the ferry and sometimes you have to cancel it because the weather changes. In an ideal universe, I would love to do prescribed burning here. And I think we all recognize that that would be the ideal way to manage that. But in reality, we just don't have the resources to do that, at least in-house as a small land trust. the insurance that we would have to carry in and of itself is way, way expensive.
Yeah, you're certainly not alone in that regard. That's a problem throughout our region. So I guess another question here from Jim comes: are pine beetles an overall benefit to pine woodlands in the bigger picture? In a way, getting at some of the things Jesse was talking about, they thin out and allow for regeneration. Are there positives along with that? I mean, we hate losing these big old pitch pines that have been part of our landscape for a long time, and maybe thinning can help to preserve some of those if it's anticipatory thinning. How do you think about pine beetles sort of in that landscape context?
No, that's an excellent question. So, the work that I just described was completely reactive to the fact that we had this infestation. We've been lucky in that we haven't had any additional infestations on Nantucket, and I think that's because this particular pine stand where it showed up is isolated. It's 13 acres in size, and there aren't a lot of, it's not like a contiguous forest of pitch pine. Unfortunately, on the vineyard, they're dealing with a completely different situation, and it really has taken off and spread like wildfire over there, so to speak. But one of the things we have been doing as an organization, and also the Nantucket Land Bank and Mass Audubon on Nantucket, is that we are slowly implementing proactive or to prevent southern pine beetle infestations by doing forest understory clearing and then thinning of trees with under our conservation or our forest stewardship plans that we've developed with GCR. We have about 180 acres of pitch pine forest that we want to see under proactive management. It's probably going to take between 10 and 15 years to get all of that treated because, again, it's very expensive, but we're slowly trying to prioritize those sites. Southern pine beetles are probably here to stay. We're very hopeful that this cold winter we're having may sort of knock them back, but, we're going to have to learn to live with them and on our landscapes here. And hopefully the way we can do that is by managing our forests to make them more resilient.
Jake, you just put a comment in the chat that I thought was very interesting, and I know you have lots and many acres of pitch pine and are sort of staring this in the face because now we have an outbreak on Cape Cod, as I'm understanding. You want to comment? Like, how are you thinking about how you're going to deal with your large area that includes so much pitch pine?
Well, some of the good news is, as Karen said, that we've known southern pine beetle is coming. And the actions to prepare a stand to make it more resistant and more resilient to southern pine beetle impacts are the same actions that pine barrens need anyway. So the thinning, the fire, those are protective measures. So we've been doing as much of that as we can over for forestry over the last decade and for fire over the last 30 years here. So we've been building that resilience in. That's part of why the statewide push from some special interest groups and whatnot to limit forestry in the state is such a misguided effort that puts our pine barrens and other natural communities at risk. But we're having to look at how we make decisions of where to act and where not to act. And so we have several spots already on the base that we've found. There are several spots in Falmouth and other places. So we're having to look, is this a stand that we've already built a lot of that resilience? And so maybe we're going to leave this patch alone. Or is it, starting on an upwind side of an area that we haven't treated yet with forestry and fire, so it's extremely susceptible, and we're likely to lose 200 acres of pitch pine in a quick amount of time. So that latter one is an area where we've already gone in and cut a couple of those because it's a much higher risk than some of the others. So we're having to be very reactive and thoughtful because it's already at a point where we don't have enough staff or money to just handle the pine beetle issue that's jumped up just this winter. And that's the big thing about it. We already have more spots than we can contend with, and it only showed up really this winter. So hopefully that answered your question. Like, we're having to think about what the stand condition already is, what we can handle, and prioritize actions based on that.
Yeah.
But
Thanks.
to the person's question that I responded to, they asked if southern pine beetle could be beneficial by opening up the pine woods, and it's a huge risk. It's not like other bark beetles that we've had here historically.
Yeah. All right, everybody. I'm going to call a few minutes break here. Thank you. Those were terrific talks in the morning. We are going to take a break. We're going to come back at exactly 11:05. And please, we're going to leave the Zoom on. Nothing changes. But please come back, because our next talk is starting 11:05 is going to be Mike Whittemore, who's going to be talking about this really neat effort that the network has been pushing and involved in, that Mike has led on cataloging the flora of Sandplain Grasslands up and down the Northeast. So we'll see you back in a few minutes at exactly 11:05.
Thank you for recording now. While we're getting Mike's presentation up, I'm Sarah Boyce. I'm the Director of Research and Conservation at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, but I'm also on the steering committee for the Sandplain Grassland Network. We're going to be getting started momentarily, but I want to thank everyone again for joining us today. We're at over 140 participants right now, and I'm really excited to see everyone. If you weren't here this morning, we've recorded all the sessions and we'll be making them available later. But without further ado, we're going to get started with our next presentation. So I'm very excited to welcome Mike Whittemore from Frenchman Bay Conservancy, but also from the Sandplain Grassland Network. This is Mike's going to be presenting about one of the papers soon to be submitted that also comes from a lot of work from the Sandplain Grassland Network. So Mike's talk is titled Distribution Status and Flora of Northern Atlantic Coastal Plain Heathland and Grassland. So thank you, Mike. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat as we go along.
I'm going to start my timer. Thank you so much, Sarah. Appreciate the introduction. So this idea for this paper came to me 8 years ago. I just finished my master's and I landed a job at Woodwell Climate Research Center under Dr. Chris Neal, who is second author on this paper. He charged me with finishing writing a guidebook for managing Sandplain Grasslands and an online library of all research of these systems. At the time, two things struck out to me. First, over the past century, there has been a tremendous amount of research on this habitat. Second, no one has ever put it all together to form a habitat-wide flora or map to describe what a Sandplain grassland is. Fast forward a couple years later, I found myself on Martha's Vineyard working for the Nature Conservancy, but this time I was responsible for restoring the systems. In order to restore a habitat, you really need to know two things. First, what is the flora, especially what the species in the highest quality sites are, so you know what the baseline is. Second, what is the condition you're restoring habitat to, which is often a function of time. Do we want to restore a habitat to, say, 300 years ago after European settlement when the region was cleared for grazing? Or do we want to restore it to, say, 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago? Every site has different goals, but the diversity in those goals could only help with conserving diversity. Personally, what I want to know is, what was the habitat long ago? Specifically, what can this flora, this new flora, and the rare species tell us about their origin in these rare species? Go ahead. Next. For those who don't know, Sandplain grasslands and heathlands as we know them today are early successional habitats along the northeast coast, kept open by disturbance like mowing, burning, grazing. We don't know what these habitats looked like long ago, but we do know that most sites experienced a long and complex land use history, including clearing and grazing after European settlement. They occur on sandy soils on the outwash plain that experience maritime influences. This is a picture from Long Point on Martha's Vineyard where I did a rare species survey. There are over a dozen rare species right in this frame. Next. Research questions. What is the spatial extent of these habitats? What's the map? We stitched together all available map data for these habitats. We mapped total habitat and sample areas where we had botanical information. What is the flora? We compiled all known botanical lists, local floras, and species plot data from experiments to form a range-wide flora. How many rare species? From our flora, now we quantified total number of rare species for the first time. How does this habitat compare to other sensitive habitats? Well, we partnered with natural heritage programs in Massachusetts and New York to supplement our rare species list with study site occurrence data from their databases. We then tallied total rare species for the habitat and compared it with other sensitive habitats in the region. Lastly, what can we learn about the origin? There's a lot of debate on this. Now that we have a full list of rare species for the first time ever, we took an approach that hasn't been done before in this habitat. We looked at the large-scale patterns in rare species ranges and over 10,000 historic herbarium records to learn about habitats those species have preferences for outside of the study area. If we know what controls their large-scale distribution and what their habitat tolerances are, perhaps it could tell us a little something about the origin of those species in the study area. Now, I took this picture on Tuckernuck Island a few years ago. This scene it's off the coast of Nantucket. This scene is filled with rare species. It was once cleared and likely used for grazing. The conditions there make it hard for trees to grow. Because of erosion and climate change, we've actually lost about 90 feet to the ocean since I took this photo. Next. All right, the study area. There are grasslands throughout the country and world. Similar habitat even exists just inland or just south or north of the study area. So what makes this different? It really comes down to soils and climate, as well as maritime influences. As the habitat name suggests, we know it's restricted to the Atlantic coastal plain, but the region extends all the way to Florida. We have to define the specific habitat in some way. What makes this habitat different is that it's bounded by what we call an ecoregion, which is really dictated by climate, I think. So our study area is the intersection between the Atlantic coastal plain and the ecoregion, which includes Cape Cod, Massachusetts Islands, Block Island, and the New York Islands. Next. So this is the map we came up with. This shows Sandplain Grassland and Heathland shown in black, and the sample areas in red. Based on all known habitat maps, Sandplain Grassland comprises of approximately 12,000 hectares across the region. That's a lot, but also it's not a lot. Our sample sites comprise of 1,800 hectares, making up about 15% of the total estimate habitat. Of course, these habitat maps are somewhat outdated and don't account for all the habitat, but provide a good idea. Notice how sparse, patchy, and spread out the habitat is. The dark gray lines are the glacial moraine, and everything south of the outwash plain is where these habitats tend to occur. Next. Now, in the interest of time, I'll go through the next couple of slides quick. All I want you to see here is that there are a lot of small grasslands and a small number of large grasslands. Massachusetts has the lion's share of the large grasslands. Okay, next. Okay. In this slide, you'll see that all sites that we studied across the range, 85% of them are in protection. Of those 55%, is protected by nonprofit organizations, which tend to dictate resources to managing these habitats and keeping them open with burning and mowing. All told, Massachusetts is definitely the stronghold for protected Sandplain grassland. Protection and management are vital for keeping existing Sandplain grasslands thriving, as we all know. Next. Right. So for the flora, we had 78 historic sort of botanical lists to work from over 64 sites. The nomenclature follows Massachusetts and New York state floras. Bob Warnerall and Steve Young on this call did a tremendous job figuring all that out. We omitted all wetland plants. Botanists culled some lists where they need to. and the growth form, duration, and native status following USDA plant database. Next. Okay, next. Got it. All right. So now let's talk about floristic characteristics for this habitat. 627 species, 86 families, 307 genera. In native status, there's 63% native species of this flora. 37% are introduced. Oop, go back. There you go. For context, Massachusetts flora has only 32% introduced. We think that the high proportion of introduced species is a result of the long and complicated land use history in the study area, including logging and agriculture. Growth form, 60% are forb, say wildflowers, and only 18% are graminoid. 11% are shrub. 73% are perennial, so there's a lot of perennials, and 24% are annual. Next. This table shows species that were found on at least 80% of the sites in descending order. Notably, across all sites, only little bluestem was found on all 64 sites. This means that there's so much variation across sites that few species occur often across all sites. If we were to define Sandplain grasslands by just this list, it would be little bluestem, northern dewberry, and sheep sorrel. Both are common and weedy species. You'd have golden tops and common goldenrods, kind of like an old field. In this list of most frequent species across all sites, there are no rare species. Next. But perhaps there's a subset of grasslands on these sites that are more similar to each other. It turns out that the highest quality grasslands are much more similar to each other across the region. That is, sites with 10 or more rare species. When we only looked at those sites, far more species turned up on 100% of those sites, including several rare species. Now, some specialists include Nantucket serviceberry, New England blazing star, coastal plain blue-eyed grass. Now, this is the list I wish we had as a baseline when I was restoring sites on Martha's Vineyard. This is what a sandplain grassland should be defined on. Next. Using a combination of species checklists and natural heritage reports, we were able to quantify rare species in occurrence data per state. In our study, there were a total of 73 rare species found. When we add data from natural heritage databases, we reach 91 rare species. That's a lot of rare species. In Massachusetts, there were 57 rare species and only 34 in New York. Notably, rare species occurred 475 times on sites in Massachusetts, but only 156 times in New York. You can see the pie charts here that show that. Looking at the table on the right, we compare this habitat with other sensitive habitats in the region. So S1 is being most sensitive, okay? Sandplain grassland and heathland were the top two most sensitive habitats for S1 habitats in Massachusetts. That's ahead of calcareous fen and maritime juniper woodland. For New York, Sandplain grassland, and they call it maritime grassland there, was the third most sensitive habitat behind rich graminoid fen and open alpine habitat. When we compare Sandplain grassland with all S1 and S3 habitats, it has the third highest number of rare species in Massachusetts and the second highest in New York. In summary, what this means is this habitat is a true biological hotspot worth conserving. And Massachusetts is the stronghold in terms of number of rare species and occurrences, or what I say, site evenness, as in rare species are much more evenly dispersed on sites in Massachusetts. Next. Next, there we go. We know that Massachusetts has the highest number in site occurrences of rare species, but let's take a closer look at what sites rise to the top in terms of quality. To my surprise, mowed fire lanes at Manuel Corella State Forest on Martha's Vineyard has the highest number of rare species at a whopping 28. What's interesting is that this site has been found to be historically wooded. Apart from the fire lanes, the forest itself is referred to as an ancient woodland for its old oak stumps and relatively minimal soil disturbances. Notably, the Martha's Vineyard Airport, which is adjacent to the forest, was logged and has been mowed ever since, yet it has fewer rare species, though it would take a survey with plots to really statistically compare the differences, but it was interesting nonetheless. Of the 21 sites with 10 or more rare species, only 3 are in New York. I repeat, of the 21 sites with 10 or more rare species, only 3 are in New York. Needless to say, the state forest is the highest quality site in terms of rare species. And Massachusetts has by far the highest number of sites with 10 or more rare species. Okay, so we looked at the nuanced local scale. Now that we have a list of all rare species for the first time, let's take a look at their large scale distribution, what that tells us about origin. We overlaid, I'm sorry, if you go to the next. There we go. We overlaid county distribution data for all rare species throughout their ranges. We then overlaid physiographic boundaries to see if we could find any patterns. In short, go back up. In short, counties with the highest number of these rare species occurred in Atlantic Coastal Plain and the Piedmont. We expected the result for Atlantic Coastal Plain. It's sandy there. But the high rare species numbers in the Piedmont was very interesting. We know that the Piedmont is mountainous and primarily wooded with oak. This tells us something about the origin or the pathways of these rare species, not so much the habitat, but the species, and their range of tolerances to other habitats. Next. All right, next we manually grouped rare species by physiographic region by looking at each rare species distribution individually. Each color represents a group of rare species that favored a physiographic region. The darker the color shade, the higher the number of rare species found in that county. This shows us in more detail the pathways and origins might have been for specific species groups. And that rare species which assemble together in Sandplain Grassland also assemble together elsewhere in other habitat types throughout the region. With these findings, it's safe to say that physiography is a major factor that controls the large-scale distribution of these species. Although humans undoubtedly influence the local scale, it's unlikely that humans cause these large-scale patterns. Next. Now let's look at historic herbarium records for all 73 rare species across their ranges. Lucky for us, when an herbarium record is recorded, there's a spot for habitat notes. Now, we transcribed over 10,000 herbarium records for these rare species from the Harvard Digital Herbarium, all known records for these species in that herbarium. The outside pie chart is for all records, and the inside refers to only records found within the study area. We classified habitat notes into broad habitat categories such as woodland, open, lowland, and nearshore habitats like beaches and marshes. Notably, of all records, by far the highest number of rare species records were found in woodland types. That was a big, go back up. That was a big surprise to me. I had always assumed that these species were reserved to open habitats along the coast. All habitat categories were remarkably similar in proportions of rare species records between all sites and the study site, except for the proportion of woodland versus open habitat. For some reason, there were more records found in open habitats versus woodland types within the study area, but the opposite outside the study area. I don't know why that is. It could be either that the study site and the sandy plain there is uniquely different physiographically or environmentally than locations outside of the study area. Or perhaps the study site experienced large-scale clearing and other human impacts like grazing sooner than the other areas in the country, which would influence what habitats these species were found in at the time of collection. Next. Okay, so again with the historic habitat preferences of rare species. Lastly, let's take a look at how rare species favored specific habitats. We tallied up the number of occurrences a species was found in habitats and classified that species as favoring the habitat if the habitat accounted for the highest proportion of occurrences for that species. In other words, if more than half of all records for a goldenrod species occurred in woodland, we just said it favored woodland. By far, the woodland types had the highest number of rare species or barium records at 54%. 54% of all rare species that we looked at preferred woodland types. Open habitat accounted for 19%. Here are some herbarium cards I came across from the early 1900s in and out of the study area. Everybody's familiar with our Malaxis species, Bayard's adder's tongue. This card says it was found in a wooded slope. Lion's foot, a Nablus species, was found in dry oak pine woods on one card. Goat's rue, or a Tephrosia species, Tephrosia virginiana, was found in dry open woods. Low frostweed, which is a Crocanthamum species, was found in dry pitch pine woods. And lastly, Sandplain yellow flax, found in dry pineland. Now, and you can stay on the slide, I thought, and I think many people thought and still think, that these species are shade intolerant, sun-loving species. The lesson here is that although species can be found at a site together, each species has their own tolerances, their own journey, their own evolution journey. Tolerances to shade, to burning, to soil disturbances, etc. If we apply one management to an entire area over and over without understanding these tolerances, especially rare species tolerances, we could be doing more harm than good in some situations. And I know this is something that we all know as restoration ecologists. That's why we have control areas and such. So these are just some ways that we can examine large-scale species patterns and habitat preferences outside the study area to inform our conservation efforts for Sandplain grassland and their connection to other habitats such as woodland, lowland, and nearshore habitats in the study area. Next. Now, in summary, we can certainly confirm and quantify that this is a highly diverse habitat with 91 rare species and among the top S1 to S3 habitats in the whole region. There's no doubt about that. We're just able to quantify it now. We can confirm and quantify that this is a small patch-forming habitat with stronghold in quantity and quality in Massachusetts, particularly on Cape Cod and the Massachusetts Islands. But Long Island is certainly important as well. We can confirm that protection and management are important for conserving existing open habitats, but be careful. Now, I want to spend a little time on this one. There's no doubt that the existing Sandplain grassland sites are and always will be vital for conserving these rare species. They are the reservoirs for many rare species. They provide grassland bird habitat and protect cultural and historic uses for these lands. But we should consider that these rare species may be waiting in the seedbed of other habitats, such as older woodland or semi-open woodland types. Today, because all of our northern Atlantic coastal plain woodlands is young, and we have no conception of what an old-growth woodland looks like here because we have none left, that these species could return on their own in those situations, possibly. In other words, it's important to manage some sites hard because it works great for many of these species, clearly, from these results. But it's equally worth leaving additional areas to just grow, like part of the Martha's Vineyard State Forest, and see what happens. Sort of like a forever wild control unit, if you will. At least until we know more about the individual rare species tolerances of all those species. So number 4. Okay, so most rare species we found prefer semi-open woodland types throughout their entire ranges. Physiographic barriers explain large-scale rare species distributions. And counties with the highest number of rare species are in not only the Atlantic coastal plain, but also the Piedmont. Next. Thank you. So now, lastly, this is the second to last slide. the future questions we could ask as scientists, all you scientists out there, restoration ecologists. We should be studying land use and management history of the high quality sites now that we have this data set. What about those sites makes them high quality? Number 2, study differences in species at Manuel Corella State Forest on Martha's Vineyard compared to the fire lanes there, compared to the Martha's Vineyard Airport. We would need to set up plots and run statistics. Number 3, study rare species tolerances like shade, long distance dispersal, and seed viability. I think this is the most important thing that could come out of this study as a springboard, is to study those. We now have a scalable species list for restoration, which will improve outcomes throughout the region. Number 5, study rare species responses to management tools, especially fire. This goes hand in hand with number 3, and I think it's very important to open it up to studying some of these rare species to fire and mowing and other management tools, so we understand the differences in tolerances. And then lastly, do these species return naturally at Manuel Corella State Forest and the Central Pine Barrens? These are the 2 largest sort of for wooded systems in the region. If left as old growth Atlantic coastal plain, oak, pine, woodland. We don't know that, and we're not going to know that for very long, but it's important to maybe consider that as part of sort of the overall matrix to conserve the species that we care so much about. Next. I just want to thank all the authors and contributors to this work. This has been a really long effort over the past 5 years. A special thank you to Dr. Chris Neal for the innumerable hours spent working through edits. More edits and drafts that I care to admit. Thank you, Chris. Polly Wiegand, who shared her work on Long Island, which made it possible to connect New York and Massachusetts data sets to form the range-wide study. We couldn't do this study without Polly. Bob Wernerall and Steve Young for leading the very difficult task of dealing with complex regional flora nomenclature updates, the species names. And lastly, Karen Lombard for letting me work on this on top of my work at the Nature Conservancy using office resources and the support. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. It's honestly so great to see and hear about the results of this project. And I'm really excited about what you're talking about of encouraging additional research. I think a lot of that information about rare species is needed for demographic modeling of how some of these species will respond over time. And so, yes, kudos to that. We have a few minutes for questions, and I will say if we don't get to your question, maybe Mike can look at the chat after too and kind of see some of the questions. Let's see, one comes from Elena. Would it be accurate to say that New York rather than Massachusetts would have had historically been home to the majority of Sandplain grasslands, given their former extensiveness on Long Island, but that those sites have been disproportionately impacted by development?
It's a great question. I'm glad it came up because with this study, we made the decision to only talk about what we have currently. And there was a lot of discussion on, we did include Hempstead Plains and Sayville Grassland, but Hempstead Plains has since been paved over for the most part. I mean, it was like a huge grassland, 50,000 acres or something like that. I agree with that. We don't know for sure, but there were a lot of lists from back then, and I compiled them all just to see at one point, and there was upwards of 400 species just for Hempstead Plains, and they were very, very similar to the composition in Massachusetts. So it just showed me that these systems are certainly connected, and at one point Long Island may have actually had more.
Continuing the age-old debate of New York versus Massachusetts.
Yes.
Another from Parker Sherman, managing oak forests with thinning and fire, driving them more towards savanna-like fuel arrangement. Biological diversity has increased across the board with native insect, bird, and plant species diversity increases. Is that correct? Sorry if I said
yeah.
that.
I mean, there's no doubt. It's a matrix. It's a patchwork. I think what I look at is the rare species we're trying to conserve. And Sandplain Grassland has a very high diversity. It's like an inverse bell curve. Okay. And the young forest is below here, has the lowest diversity because it's very shady. But then there's all these different woodland types that we can influence with management. The one thing that we've taken our eye off of is the old growth woodland. So I think that the Sandplain grasslands would have different composition and abundance, and old growth woodland perhaps could have some of these species come back in a different way. But there's no doubt that savannas and burning and management is very important. It's just all about the diversity of management and the outcomes.
Great. Thank you, Mike. There are a few more questions in the comments, and then some accolades for you. So make sure you check that out.
Awesome. Thank you.
As we transition to the next talk, Bob, if you want to go ahead and put up your slides. I'm happy to introduce Bob Wernerall, presenting today on behalf of the New England Botanical Society. Bob's going to be presenting on which source to choose for a plant's name, regional or global, nomenclature and taxonomy in Sandplain grasslands and heathlands. So thank you so much for joining us today, Bob. Also, Bob is on our Sandplain Grassland Steering Committee and was, as you just heard, very instrumental in Mike's paper.
Thank you, Sarah, very much, and thanks everybody for being here. We had a huge turnout today, and especially thanks to Mike for what the talk he just gave, and for years pushing forward this paper as we all pitched in when we could. So the work I did was, I'm going to go back one slide here, sorry. Was along with Steve Young, and before that, with a little help from Roberta Lombardi, I saw she was on here too. We worked specifically on the taxonomy and nomenclature for these regional plant lists. So as you could tell from Mike's talk, we consider this paper to be kind of foundational in a certain way. It'll provide a really important baseline, and it's very regional in the extent, which is a little unusual, right? It involves two different states, Massachusetts and New York. So it doesn't go beyond that. So it's not specific to one state. So we had a lot of questions that we had to deal with, and we were going to come up with a list, a refined list, and a as correct as possible list of the plant names that we were going to use. And as you saw before too, there were 64 study sites. So there were a lot of different surveyors. So there were a lot of possibilities for a lot of variation, shall we say. We didn't go with USDA plants. I'm going to talk about that. We didn't go with Kew, Plants of the World Online. We went instead with some regional experts that I'll show you in just a bit. And I'm going to talk also a little bit about interest-specific names, varieties and subspecies. We set up a system of rules to refine the list. And then at the end, don't go away, this won't be all boring. I'm going to show specific species that are still either favored by this approach or still in flux. So I like to use the term scientific names, and I encourage that when you are talking about, a lot of people say, well, the Latin names of plants or this and that, or animals for that. But they're scientific names at heart for this big reason, at least when it comes to plants. You have this perfect Sandplain grassland species, bearberry, which is a full combination of two Greek words in the beginning for the genus and two Latin words for the specific epithet. So bear, the Greek is bear and cluster of grapes, and the Latin is a grape and a bear. So if we got bearberry in perfect alignment, I just think it's important because I think people will get more, when they learn plant names, more out of understanding the Greek origin a lot, which occurs very often in these and often ties in to some interesting stories because obviously the Greek language in many ways predated the Latin. So common names are useful and colorful, and we certainly don't discourage their use in any, especially in this age where scientific names are changing more rapidly than we would like. Common names can be very helpful, but they're not very precise. So, and they can be misleading with terms like blue-eyed grass, for example. which of course is related more to irises than to grasses. And the scientific names have the benefit of providing relationships. If you have several plants in the same genus, you know they're all related in some way, and there's several genera within the same family. And those aren't just sort of taxonomic issues, those are habitat issues as well. So Cystacea, the rock rose family, all over the world is a drought-adapted, fire-adapted family. And they have traits that relate to their ability to thrive and survive on the Sandplain Grasslands. So why do scientific names keep changing? I don't know if you've wondered about this. I certainly have. It's, in a sense, the curse of good field botanists, because we keep getting more things we have to remember. The joke is, you're never out in the field with a botanist if they're listing off some name without them saying, and it used to be this. So we have a lot to remember. And I started thinking about this a little bit differently lately, as names are always just a hypothesis and they're subject for further review. So the set name, let's say the one for dominant salt marsh grass, Spartina alterniflora, can be considered essentially the null hypothesis. And you figure that's the name for good. And as time goes on, people throw up evidence against that null hypothesis. And that evidence accumulates over time and becomes overwhelming. That's when the plant name has to change. And so it's now in the genus Sporobolus. And that has to do with their phylogenetic work. And so we have to learn to accept that, because all names are basically a hypothesis. There's a whole lot of reasons why name change that I won't go into. Fortunately, there are international rules that are voted on once every 10 years. So why didn't we go with USDA for plant names? Well, mainly because they're largely out of date. This plant, Kamisaki polygonifolia, which we know more commonly from all sources, Euphorbia polygonifolia, grows along all our beaches and dunes, especially those that are not driven on, by the way, another of my pet peeves. This name fell out of use entirely by 2010, but it's still kept by USDA. So it's old. They have actually some other much older. And Euphorbia actually went back before Kamisaki, before 1980 or so. That was the name of choice, and it went to Kamisaki. Now it's back to Euphorbia, but USDA is not able to keep up with that. They're not that well staffed. They're not richly staffed for the 35 or so thousand names they have to deal with of native species. We did, however, if you see in this slide for USDA website, the lower three parts, we did use them as a source to determine whether they were annual, perennial, biennial, or the growth habit, forb, herb, shrub, and the native status. So we did use standardized sources throughout for that. And we didn't go with Q because they have so many names, 1.44 million to deal with. And also the ratio of experts per plant name is too slim to really keep up. They're great with plants from Europe and Asia, where they have a lot of staff members that specialize in that kind of thing. And we did use them for that, and a point I'll get to later on. So we felt it was really important to go with local experts, and for a variety of reasons. But one of them is, as Mike pointed out, we want these lists to be used by local conservationists on the ground. So we want them to be able to have names that they're familiar with, but also look at these sources online to double check what is the proper plant name that they're dealing with, and even see, in the case of New York Flora Atlas, you can see herbarium records directly listed below the plant. So that's pretty cool. So that's one of our sources for New York. And of course, that's headed by, curated by this man in the lower left there, David Weirier, looking like a perfect field botanist there. And everyone knows that David is highly respected. And then in the center there, my co-worker on this project, Steve Young, a good friend, and Steve, of course, was more than 30 years the state botanist of New York. So he brought a lot to the table. And really, we went through row by row, starting with 640 rows, and whittled it down over many different drafts to try to get the most correct and most appropriate nomenclature. And then for Massachusetts, of course, we use Flora Novae Anglii, and that's being updated. So you can see Arthur Haynes on the left is the lead author, and that should be updated and come out either this year or the next year. And Arthur supplied us with a spreadsheet of the names that he intends to use for the update. So we were perfectly up to date with that for the source that's about to come out. So what are interest-specific names and why are they important? I used to think, well, plant lists as you carry into the field or carry in your mind, they're a lot easier if you don't have to remember the varieties. This is all, you know, the load on the memory quotient in your brain. And I used to think that, but I've thought about that a lot more differently now that you get into the really nitty-gritty details. Remember when I talked about plant names being a hypothesis? Well, the cool thing about interspecific names is that these are often working their way along the chain of evidence against the null hypothesis or in favor of it. And so the varieties and sometimes subspecies, or a variety may work its way to a subspecies, then the subspecies may work its way all the way to the species level. And that's part of the important process. Now for us, humans eating every day at the table, we may encounter some very familiar subspecies or varieties as well. So if you're at the restaurant and you order Brassica oleracea variety capitata cabbage, and you instead get variety italica broccoli, you're going to be really surprised. And you can demand a change in the subspecies. So we had a set of rules that we used, and I'll just mention a few of them. Of course, if it only occurs in one state, we'll use the name from that state. Now, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the names, I would say, agreed between the two states, but that still left well over 100 species to deal with in terms of resolving the conflicts between the two entities. We used more Massachusetts names than New York if it was a tie. We used Q to tip Plants of the World Online to tip the scale if there was disagreement on non-native names. So that was a 2 out of 3 vote, which of the names would be common. And as I said, Q is a real expert on the European and Eurasian sources. We used Flora of the Southeast US, FSUS, Alan Weekly's website out of North Carolina, to tip the scale on native species if their distribution was slightly further south. And there's a swap rule here I'm going to get to. So, and you can read about all the rules when the papers come out and decide whether we did the right thing or not. There were some misidentifications because we had so many surveyors. Sometimes mistakes are made. And this is one I picked up from having worked in Midwestern prairies. Someone reported Brackelia on the site, and we didn't want to throw out the data. It doesn't occur in New England or in this region at all, but it does occur in Midwest prairies. And in fact, the name is Brackelia eupatorioides, hinting that in fact it does look like Eupatorium hissipifolium, which is common on our Sandplain Grasslands, which is the picture on the right. By the way, that's Crane. That's a site at Crane Wildlife Management Area. So we were able to clarify this liatris that's been mentioned before, and in thanks in part to a publication that Steve wrote in conjunction with Kanchi Gandhi and Paul Summers. And it's been talked about already. It's a very important local endemic and very much of a Sandplain grassland specialist. Criticus schizophila has been kind of verified in the past 2 decades, especially the last decade, as not being part of Criticus macrophylla and at a varietal level. So there's Margaret Curtin on the vineyard, the only known location. The island is the only known location for this. And Greg Palermo sauntering by Long Point, which Russ Hopping and is doing some great restoration work out at Long Point, and Shay is on here as well. So this is a species we're still putting pressure on iNaturalists to change, and there's a lot of debate about this. But this is really a classic Sandplain grassland shrub, Salix occidentalis. It's one we don't want to disappear. Agellinus acuta still under dispute. They're trying to subsume that under Agellinus decimloba. I'm pushing back, hopefully with others, because phylogenetically it still shows up sometimes as being a separate species. And this very important Sandplain grassland specialist, although it occurs in all inland sandy sites as well, Viola fimbriatula or fimbriatula, it's not the old Viola sagittata, which people used to think it was. And I'm going to try to clear out here now. So just remember to kiss and love your Sandplain grassland species when you see them. And here's the site that Polly herself and the people from Maine helped to keep open, Kennebunk Plains. Absolutely gorgeous site. So get out there and enjoy it. And with this slide, I will say thank you.
Thank you, Bob, so much. That looks a lot better than when I went to Kennebunk Plains and there was a thunderstorm, but I had to see the liatris. Thanks so much. And we don't have time for questions, but Bob, if you want to check out the chat in case there's anything that you specifically want to answer there. All right. So I'm really looking forward to, once again, introducing our next speaker. Patrick, if you want to start to get your slides up, and I will introduce you. Great. So next we have Patrick Farrar, who's speaking for Woodwell Climate Research Center on a talk entitled Current Status and Long-Term Trends of Plant Species Richness and Growth Forms in Martha's Vineyard Grasslands. Thank you, Patrick.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. Can you all see this okay and hear me?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, wonderful. All right, let me hide these. There we go. All right. Yeah, so thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Mike and Bob, for your great talks ahead of mine. They set this up really nicely. So I'm Patrick Farrar. I'm a research assistant working with Dr. Chris Neal at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. And yeah, I'll get right into it if I can. There we go. So I won't dwell too long on this intro here because it's set up really nicely by others before me, but Sandplain grasslands are really important regional biodiversity hotspots in the Northeast US. So managing them effectively to sustain their biodiversity over time is a conservation priority. Some concerns that have come up recently among Sandplain grassland managers are increases in woody species, increases in non-native and invasive species, and declining biodiversity in these grasslands. And as Mike alluded to in his talk, Martha's Vineyard and Massachusetts as a whole, but especially Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket have really high concentrations of high quality Sandplain grassland sites that are all or mostly owned and or managed by conservation groups. So these 5 sites here are all managed by the Nature Conservancy. And these are our study sites. These are just little snapshots of what the 5 sites look like. So really these 4 sites, the Bamford Preserve, Kanamika Preserve, Katama Airfield, and Mazar property are more on the grassland end of the spectrum, whereas Medicine Lots Preserve is more of a thinned scrub oak frost bottom. So we wanted to survey the vegetation at all of these 5 sites, which involved establishing new vegetation plots at 3 of the sites and relocating existing ones at the Katama Airfield and Mazar property where they already existed. And we wanted to look at the species composition there. So we identified species present and estimated their abundance or their percent cover in these 3 by 3 meter quadrats. So you lay out these 3 meter PVC pipes in a square, identify all the plants within and estimate their percent cover in the plot to get an idea of the plant composition at a site. We also compiled historical vegetation data from those two sites that had existing plots, and this allowed us to try to evaluate the current status and the longer term trends in the plant communities at these sites. So just to break this down a little bit, first I'm going to compare and talk about the 5 sites in the 2025 survey. These are 2 figures of species richness, or just the number of different unique plant species. So this figure on the left is per plot species richness, and this figure on the right is the site total species richness. So you have the 5 different sites here corresponding to their different colors. Really, all I want to point out here is that the 4 grassland sites all have this pretty narrow range of pretty similar species richness on average per plot. And then the shrubland site, the scrub oak frost bottom site, is lower. That goes for the total species at the site as well. Also, forb species make up a really large amount of the species richness at the grassland sites. And then there's arguably sort of this inverse relationship between the graminoid species richness and woody species richness in a plot. Also, unsurprisingly, the shrubland site has a high species richness of woody species on average in plots. So this is now talking about species abundances, or their percent cover. On the left, again, this is just the distributions of different growth form groups, their percent cover in plots. So interestingly, but maybe not super surprisingly, like I was saying, forb species make up a really large part of the species richness of grassland sites, but their cover or their abundance is generally quite low. Graminoid species, which are grasses, rushes, and sedges, and woody species, which for our purposes here are trees, shrubs, subshrubs, and vines lumped together. The graminoid and woody species are really where the high abundances are. It's also really interesting to point out that with the exception of Bamford, which had really high graminoid cover and very low woody species cover, the other 3 grassland sites have pretty similar cover of graminoids and woody species. So although these are grasslands, they're mosaics of having a lot of abundant woody species as well. So the medicine lots, the scrub oak, shrubland, really low graminoid and forb cover, really high woody species cover. That's not surprising. So Bamford, with this really high graminoid cover, though, if you break down on the right here, what types of graminoids are making up the cover at these different sites, Bamford has a really high cover of non-native cool season grasses. These are agricultural grasses, like in this instance, mostly smooth brome, sweet vernal grass, Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, things like that. So that's a high amount of the cover at Bamford. Then Bamford, Kanamaka, and Katama all had pretty similar cover of native warm season grasses. These are usually foundational sandplain grassland species. Like Mike showed, this is mostly little blue stem, which was that grass that he identified as being in all of the sandplain grassland sites. Then Kanamaka and Mazar both have a fair amount of, or really a lot of, other graminoid cover. This is mostly Carex pennsylvanica, which Sarah talked about earlier as well. So this is just to show the community composition differences between these 5 sites. It shouldn't come as much of a surprise based on the last few slides that the composition of the plant communities at these sites are all pretty distinct. And Mike kind of touched on that as well. There's not necessarily a classical these 10 species are in every single sandplain grassland. So on the right here, you have, well, so really the point of this figure is that the more overlap there is with the ellipses, the more similar the plant communities are. So you have medicine lots, the shrublands, all the way out here to one side, because it's really dominated by woody species and doesn't have a whole lot of forb and graminoid species. The only overlap with it at all is at Mazar. Then all the way on the other side, you have Bamford, which had basically no woody species cover and had a lot of non-native cool season grasses. And then the other grasslands are kind of between those two, Kanamika having a really wide range and overlapping with the other three. And then Katama, and Mazar really didn't overlap with Bamford at all, because they're really dominated by native grasses and woody plants. So this is to show that the species richness and abundance of non-native and invasive species at these sites. Bamford had the most non-native species and by far the most non-native species cover, but that's largely due to those non-native grasses that I was talking about. Kanamika and Katama sort of had intermediate numbers of non-native species, but the cover of them was quite low. Kanamika had somewhat more, like I was saying, it kind of like Bamford had more cover of those non-native cool season grasses. And then at Katama, Mazar, and Medicine Lots, the cover of non-native and invasive species was extremely low. This is really just to show that we don't pick up rare and uncommon species very much in these plots when we do them. The species richness and percent cover of rare and uncommon species was very low across all sites in 2025. So now I'm going to get into some of the trends over time at the sites for which we have historical data. So really the main points of these are, we have time on the x-axis for both, and it's the same breakdown of species categories as the previous figures. The main point here is that although there was some noise in some of the early surveys at the Mazar site, and you can really see that over long stretches of time, 25 plus years, the species richness of different functional life forms of plants has remained quite stable over time at these sites, which is pretty encouraging. The number of woody species and forb species has potentially gone up at Mazar, but it's not like we're seeing an explosion of different woody species coming in and losing forbs and graminoids over time. And then when you look at the trends in abundance or percent cover of these different groups over time, to be clear, the huge explosion of plant cover at the Mazar site was because it was cleared from woodland here back in the early 2000s. So the cover of all plants has just risen over time. But it seems like it still hasn't really leveled out. So it still seems like it's increasing over time, and a lot of that cover increase does seem to be coming from woody species, but the cover of forbs and graminoids is level or increasing over time as well. At Katama, you potentially see that in recent years, the last decade or so, graminoids, particularly warm season grasses, little bluestem really, is potentially increasing in cover over time, and the woody species, primarily the clonal shrub low bush blueberry, seems to be maybe tapering off over time. But if you look at the start of the record to the end, these aren't really substantial changes in the cover of different growth form groups over time. And also the richness and cover of non-native and invasive species has been low and remained low throughout the record at both sites. And similarly, it's not like we used to be detecting all sorts of rare and uncommon species in surveys, and now we aren't. It's through the whole record, it's very rare to see species richness or cover of rare and uncommon species. So some major takeaways, that the Katama airfield and Mazar sites are quite species rich and have very low cover of non-native grasses, or really any non-native plants for that matter. And they've been quite stable over time, which suggests that the management at those sites is working quite well. Bamford is maybe less species rich than those sites, and has a high cover of non-native grasses. Kanamika is kind of this intermediate site, where there was it shared characteristics with all three of the other grasslands. And then the medicine lots were the least species rich in terms of plants. As many others on this call will know, it's not like these scrub oak barrens are not, they're very biodiverse places, but at least at this recently cleared one, the species richness of plants is not very high at this point. And it's dominated by woody species as opposed to the even more so filled with woody species than the other sites. And all sites had low detection of rare and invasive species in these surveys. So with that, I'd like to thank the Nature Conservancy for funding this work. And I don't really have much time, but I'm happy to look at the chat and answer questions or anything like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. It's really interesting to see that with over 25 years, that change or not change over time. We don't have time for questions, but Patrick, if you want to, like you said, check out the chat, see if there's any follow-up questions. And next, while we get the slide settled, we're going to have Jack Schneider from the Henry L. Ferguson Museum talking about land use history of Middle Farms Flats and Fishers Island, New York. So go ahead, Jack. Thanks for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having this. Jessica and I are both here, and I'm Jack Schneider from the Henry L. Ferguson Museum on Fishers Island. The subject of this presentation is the 40-acre Middle Farms Grassland. Its historic land use, current ecology, and ongoing management. However, starting out with a wider picture, Fishers Island is about 2 miles from Connecticut and even closer to Rhode Island. Similar to other nearby coastal islands, Fishers was formed by glacial outwash and is pocked by kettle holes. It's about 7 miles long east to west and 1.5 miles at the widest. It covers an area of about 5 square miles. The Land Trust conserves about 83 parcels, about 375 acres, 14% of the island. 71 of these are fee parcels indicated in red. 10 shown in blue are easements, and 2 others are managed by contract. During their excellent 2021-22 comprehensive study of museum properties, New York Natural Heritage Program staff identified 7 natural communities of statewide significance. These are coastal oak hickory forest, coastal salt pond, marine rocky intertidal, maritime bluff, and 2 types of shrub swamps. In addition, the island's perimeter hosts the most abundant and healthy marine eelgrass meadows in Long Island Sound. Unfortunately, the Middle Farms Grassland, also known as the Flats, shown in the middle of this map, is not considered to be a significant community based on its floristic composition and land use history. The 40-acre Flats is low-lying, and the southernmost areas can experience stormwater flooding from Block Island Sound. It's surrounded by habitats important to conservation. To the northeast is the freshwater Middle Farms Pond, where 2 rare plant species have been identified. The coastal ponds along the southern edge are brackish. Beach Pond, the smaller of the two, on the right is where 5 rare plant species grow along the shoreline. Island Pond towards the west on the left not only supports a thriving commercial oystering operation, but also a breeding population of diamondback terrapins. The white strand of Barrier Beach is a stable nesting ground for shorebirds, including piping plovers. The marine rocky intertidal community is a portion of that community that wraps around the island and is the largest of that type in New York State. To the northwest is the golf ball driving range, which is very important to golfers, but not so much to us. Prior to European settlement, most of Fisher's Island was thought to be forested, including the flats. The fact that we are continuously controlling woody succession at Middle Farms reinforces that likelihood. Native American presence on the island goes back 7,000 years. The volume of archaeological evidence housed at the museum suggests a year-round presence with a seasonal surge during the growing season. That's much less like as we see today, when the island's population increases tenfold from about 250 year-round residents. About 1,000 years ago, Native American activities likely included the traditional mound plantings of the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash. The excavated sites and artifacts have been found only on the more protected north side of the island, across from the mainland. Adrian Block's 1614 map shows the Pequot and Mohegan nations in close proximity to the north, although the Nahegans, as the map shows, are only a little farther away on Long Island. Beginning in the mid-1600s, European colonists started clearing forests for lumber and livestock. Initially, goats were encouraged to roam across the island in order to clear out the understory. Once the goats had done their work, they were replaced by sheep, cattle, dairy, and haying. Surrounded by water, the movements of grazing livestock were restricted to fields that were bounded by 7 cross-island stone walls. Even as early as colonial times, exotic grasses were being imported from England and planted to improve livestock forage. As the island passed through 3 successive owners and times changed, so did land use priorities. During the early 1900s, Middle Farms Flats, called Flat Plains Farms at the time, was a dairy farm. This aerial image on the left from the mid-1920s shows the flats as pasture. In 1924, dairy farming at Middle Farm stopped as the priority for land use on Fishers shifted away from farming towards being a fancy and exclusive resort. Reflecting the interests of the new privileged clientele, the flats became the host site for equestrian events which lasted until the late 1920s. The abandoned pastures succeeded to shrubland, which provided habitat for hunting game birds and became the site for competitive bird dog trials. One breed in particular, the Springer Spaniel, was favored. The breed's relatively small stature allows them to pass through woody shrublands with less impedance than larger breeds like pointers and setters, for example. Except for the war years, these high-quality competitions continued for 20 years until 1948, when they were relocated off-island. During the next 30 years until the mid-1990s, the flats were used for hunting game birds, including pheasants and woodcock and waterfowl. Wanting to attract birds, members of the sporting club planted and then abandoned 5-acre pockets of corn in 2 successive locations. Except for the managed cornfields, the flats were left to natural succession and became increasingly woody with shrubs and trees. The activity changed as portions of the flats gradually became protected under the auspices of the museum in 1983, 84, 96, and 2003. During this period, the trail network was introduced, the cornfields were abandoned, and hunting was stopped, although grudgingly, even persisting until 2012. Today, the sanctuary consists of 4 fee parcels and 2 easements. After becoming protected, succession was suppressed by both mowing and burning. Full field burns took place when the grass was dry, but this was intermittent and unpredictable because it was conducted by just a handful, sometimes 2 or 3 volunteers. If the area was not burned, attempts were made to mow it. In general, the entire flats was cleared at least every 2 years. The importance of maintaining the flats to the museum and the island community is evidenced by the number of Museum Commission management surveys and the resulting recommendations. These surveys were either specific to Middle Farms or as part of a broader parcel-wide management planning. One of the consistent recommendations has been to reduce the scale of the trail network. However, the trade-off between recreation and conservation has been controversial, although there have been significant trail reductions. This is a section of the closely mowed trail looking south towards Block Island Sound. As part of a comprehensive biological assessment of the museum properties by New York Natural Heritage, as I mentioned earlier, based on agricultural history and floristics, the flats were classified as being semi-natural grasslands. Bounded to the east by Middle Farms Pond Road, the flat supports 3 grassland associations. The rose-colored area is about 28 acres of semi-natural grassland, which is dominated by switchgrass. About 3 acres, mapped in brown, is semi-natural grassland dominated by big blue stem. At about 5 acres, the shallow emergent marshes, shown in blue, are dominated by blue joint grass. The 2 areas in yellow are successional shrublands where the 2 cornfields had been located. This slide shows and compares the floristic qualities of the 3 grassland communities based on standard quantifiable criteria: species richness, percent native versus non-native, coefficients of conservatism, COC in this chart, and floristic quality index, FQI. Overall, as the metrics indicate, based on estimates of coefficients of conservatism and floristic quality, the semi-natural grasslands, abbreviated as SNG in this chart, have to be categorized as degraded when compared to natural grasslands. The shallow emergent marsh, SEM, is slightly better condition, just squeezing into the moderately good condition range. This photo shows an area at the north end of the larger 28-acre panicum-dominated grassland. It's shown in rows again. Here, the Heritage Survey reported the shrub layer included black cherries, shining sumac, arrowwood, and dewberry, the tallest at about 1.5 meters. The grasses included switchgrass, Rhode Island bentgrass, and little bluestem. The listed herbs were thoroughwort, 2 species of goldenrod, and sow thistles. 3 species of vines are ubiquitous. About 71% of the species were native at that time. About 60 years ago, during the late 50s, early 60s, the field in this photo was stripped of topsoil, which was moved to improve conditions at a golf course. This northern area of the flats is home to wells that is the sole source of the island's drinking water. This photo shows an area typical of the 3-acre andropogon-dominated grassland shown in brown on the map. Here, the Heritage Survey reported the shrub layer consisted of southern bayberry and both staghorn and shining sumac. The grasses included big and little bluestem, Rhode Island bentgrass, switchgrass, and Indian grass. The herbs were identified as thoroughwort and goldenrod. This area is very viney, mostly with invasive vines. At that time, about 79% of the species were native. The shallow emergent marshes, dominated by blue joint grass, were found in 2 locations as indicated in blue. 13 points were sampled from this community. The linear marsh is formed by a channel that had been cut across the flats. It conducts outflows from Middle Farms Pond to Beach Pond, and the water volume fluctuates seasonally. At one point within the linear wetland, the surveyor found that common blackberry and elderberry were the dominant shrubs. The grasses were primarily blue joint grass and switchgrass. The dominant herbaceous species were Joe Pyeweed, grass-leaved and wrinkled goldenrod, thoroughwort, and smartweed. This is one unusual instance for the museum where there are no invasive species identified. It's 100% native. Beginning in 2013, the museum dropped the inconsistent full field burns and adopted a fireman's schedule that burned portions of the grassland on a 1/3 triennial rotation, setting aside 2/3 of the burn units for recruitment. However, just as before, the schedule could not be implemented consistently, and as a result, the grassland became increasingly shrubby. Last March, we started a full field annual burn to bring the woodies under control. The burn was followed immediately by a full field mowing to cut the undesirable woody stems. We're evaluating whether to mow after each of the next planned burns. However, this may be unnecessary because of the intensive and effective fire and the resulting top kill. Once we evaluate the cumulative effect of these whole field burns on woody growth, we may restart a rotational burn on a 1.5 to 2 year schedule. For instance, we burn half the field in the spring and then 20% of the unburned field of the unburned area in the fall, and then reverse the following year. These images show the effect of the burn and help to visualize the degree of woody establishment at different areas. The most abundant shrub stems in these photos are bayberry, sumac, and arrowwood viburnum. If not killed by the fire, then they were severely damaged. Prior to the burn, slender blue flag were found only in just 3 pockets. Subsequent to the burn, we found this abundance of blue flag throughout the entire grassland. It was a wondrous sight. Concluding with a reiteration of the statement of value, along with a sampling of the New York Natural Heritage findings and photos specific to Matty Matheson Wildlife Sanctuary, we found 5 rare plant species, 10 pollinator species, 10 species of dragon and damselflies, including the rare seaside dragonlet, the only dragonfly in the U.S. that breeds in salt water. There's abundant bird life, including tree swallows, black rails, and harriers. Surrounding the flats, there are 4 osprey nesting sites. Despite some shortcomings, the ecological value of the flats is a testament to the resilience of nature. In sum, the Middle Farms Grassland is a valuable conservation resource for both the island and the region. It is a source of pride for the island community, and it provides a wonderful connection with nature. Stewarding the grassland is both a challenge and a privilege, and we're consistently learning and improving. I wanted to also mention that the full contents of the New York Natural Heritage Program study, if you're interested, are available on the museum's website. And Jessica and I thank you for your time and your insights, and hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Jack. We are a tiny bit over time, but so if you have questions for Jack or Jessica, if you want to put it in the chat, then they can help monitor the chat. And I think their contact information was on that last slide as well. All right, so our our last 3 talks before the break are going to be lightning talks. So we're going to get started. I don't know, Polly, is this one that you are monitoring or managing the slideshow, or
Yes.
Fred, are you? Okay,
I will
great.
do it to Fred, and then Kevin and Rich will load up their own. So.
Okay, great. So while we get the next slide up, I will introduce our next speaker. We have Fred Motor, who is speaking to us from the town of Needham, Massachusetts. And his talk is Protecting Habitat in a Small Inland Sandplain Grassland. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and hello. I want to thank Karen Lombard for introducing me to this network. I'm learning a tremendous amount today. So Needham is 9 miles west of Boston, a town wrapped on 3 sides by the Charles River. The town's Conservation Commission oversees the 350-acre Ridge Hill Reservation, comprised of a long glacial esker running north-south, substantial wetlands on either side, and a 7-acre grassland at the southern end of this esker. Next slide, please. This aerial view shows a driveway lined with old eastern white pines running south to north and dividing the grassland in half. The area had farms in the 16 and 1700s, and we believe the land was grazed rather than tilled. There seems to be a very intact native seed bank. The NRCS map calls the soil Hinckley 245B. Just after the Civil War, an eccentric sewing machine tycoon bought 750 acres and created an amusement park nearby. Then in 1906, a summer estate was built at the north end of this meadow. The town bought the property in 1972, and since then it has been primarily used for hiking and dog walking. Next slide, please. This photo looks west and shows, to me, a remarkably undisturbed grassland of little bluestem and Pennsylvania sedge. Interspersed are areas of lowbush blueberry, wild strawberry, and stiff aster. And in areas with some shade, moss and lichens dominate. It's been my sense that the fear of ticks may be the strongest protective factor for this grassland, keeping foot traffic off. However, the ticks may also be compelling the mowing crew to widen the 1 footpath through the grassland to as much as 30 feet wide. And in the droughty summers recently, this wide mown path gets quite degraded. Next slide. This photo shows an area with ground cover of mosses and lichens and favoring blueberry and strawberry over the grasses. Boulders were placed some time ago to keep people from driving on these meadows. But about twice each winter, I see the tracks of joyriders in the snow, I'm afraid. Last slide, please. So questions we have. A specific one would be, is there an optimal season and frequency for mowing this grassland? More generally, which vulnerability of this habitat should be our priority? What should we be monitoring? The encroachment of turf grass along the east side of the driveway is concerning. And we need to help the public understand and love this habitat. For example, in this photo, numerous ground-dwelling bees are seen in the spring, but only if you know where to look. I'll close saying thank you to all the presenters because I've learned a great deal today. And I look forward to hearing from any of you if you have suggestions to share for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Fred. If anyone has suggestions or wants to answer some of Fred's questions, feel free to put them in their comment or put your contact information that he may be able to reach out to you. All right, so now we have for our next lightning talk, thank you again, Fred. We have Kevin Omerad from Bluestem Meadows based in Rhode Island. And his talk is Soil Chemistry, Alterations in Grasslands by Native and Non-Native Invasive Species. So thank you, Kevin, for being here today. And
my pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me. You can hear me?
I can hear you just fine, and
Wonderful.
I can see your slides. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Thanks everyone for having me. I just have 5 minutes, so I'll skip over a lot of the formalities, but please know that they are there. My name's Kevin. I've started a small restoration company trying to preserve sensitive areas, many of which are in our coastal habitats in Rhode Island. Part of the process is defining the terrestrial communities. What habitats are we preserving? What state are we trying to get them back into? And we're doing that by using historical records and by also extrapolating species occurrences, kind of using our intuition and creativity to wonder, how did this plant get here? My background is geological oceanography and soil science. I primarily focused in kind of recreating past environments, what they looked like, what current habitats look like, and what they will look like in the future. And those are mainly glacially dominated habitats. Let's see if I can get to the next screen. Oh. So I'm not necessarily making a case that Rhode Island has extensive sandplain habitat. I'm just bringing to light we certainly do have some of this species, and it kind of goes into the focus of mine of soil variability, of less so trying to create those extensive grasslands and trying to find those small pristine patches where the efforts that we have will be useful in preserving them, and not necessarily putting energy that we don't have in places that they aren't going to be useful. I'm sure many of you know what I mean with the extensive invasion we have. So these are just some herbarium records of different sandplain species, some pretty pictures of those species in Rhode Island. Not necessarily sandplain, sand barren, and sandplain adjacent. And that's a little bit of what my focus is that there are species encroaching, and many of them are native, and they alter soils. So I'm kind of curious about the methods in which they alter the soils, and a lot of that's happening through microbial means. A lot of them are microbial inoculators. They fix nitrogen with different bacteria, and that results in some of those sensitive, barren spots to be converted into no longer barren. It's changing, it's altering the soil to a state that's no longer replicatable. And Jesse this morning actually touched a lot of that. Some of the species that are doing them are native bayberry, the cedars, goldenrods. I found this kind of interesting. I don't know if it's correct. GoBotany has Canadian goldenrod as not native to southern New England or southern Rhode Island, Nantucket, and a little bit of like Woods Hole area. Found that interesting. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm kind of really running through stuff. My main interests are kind of what's causing the alterations in the soil. That's, in my opinion, a lot of the actual polyphenols and the soil exudates from the plants themselves. They are converting the form of the molecules and the nutrients in the soil from a mineralized form into a plant available form. So they are enriching the soils. And I'm just curious how that's affecting the sensitive barren areas that we're trying to bring back. Can a nitrified, enriched soil return to a barren? That's really my main focus, and I think I'm pretty much out of time. So my main goal is to make connections, to connect with others, and to continue learning more. So thank you for having me, and I've also learned a whole lot today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, so much. And thank you for, being on time, especially these lightning talks. So keep your slide up for just a minute, because if anyone wants to have Kevin's contact info, it's right there. We're definitely interested to hear more. And so if you have any follow-up questions for Kevin, go ahead and put them in the chat. There might be time for discussion over lunch too, if anyone wants to stay. All right, so thank you so much again, Kevin. Now for our last talk before the break, we have Rich Coos. Rich is on our steering committee as well for the Sandplain Grassland Network. He's also the Natural Neighbors Program Director at Biodiversity Works on Martha's Vineyard. And he's going to be talking today about a plant I love to hate, miscanthus. So alternative plants for miscanthus, a swap out program for an invasive horticultural species. Thanks for being here today, Rich.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, and I just want to make sure you know I'm just going to time it for 5 minutes, so don't look at your clock as to exactly what time
Oh,
you're supposed to
sure.
end. You got
Yeah,
5 minutes.
no problem. Yeah, so I took this literally as a lightning talk, no slides. So
Okay.
I'm just going to go. So for those who don't know, Miscanthus sinensis is a widely used ornamental grass. For years, it's been marketed as an attractive, hardy, and low maintenance landscape plant. But more recently, it's been recognized for something else. Its aggressive growth and its ability to outcome native vegetation. So as a result, Miscanthus has now been designated as an invasive species and is prohibited from sale in Massachusetts. On Martha's Vineyard, however, the story doesn't end with a regulation. Continued commercial availability and residential planting still pose real risk to our native plant communities and to sensitive coastal habitats, and more specifically to Sandplain Grasslands, as many residential properties that abut this globally rare ecosystem have Miscanthus sinensis planted on their properties. So a grant came available at the end of the year from Department of Fish and Game, and we kind of took an opportunity to apply for some funding. We're still waiting to hear. However, we want to fulfill a fantasy of ours with this money to end this problem at the point of sale before they can sell the rest of their stock, rather than relying solely on enforcement of penalties. This effort takes a coordinated, preventative approach to removing Miscanthus from commercial circulation on the vineyard, while supporting local businesses and engaging a broader community. The first phase focuses on outreach. We'll work directly with nurseries, landscapers, and plant vendors to identify the remaining inventory of Miscanthus sinensis and to facilitate its removal from sale. The emphasis here is on collaboration, not confrontation. By prioritizing communication, compliance, and economic fairness, we're able to move quickly and effectively without putting local businesses in a difficult position. We'll have a trained professional with expertise in both invasive and native plant management conduct site visits there. These visits will serve several purposes: verifying their plant quantities, documenting their compliance, and coordinating collection logistics to ensure transparency and consistency across all participating vendors. Once identified, all the plant material will be handled with extreme care. Licensed haulers will transport the plants using strict containment protocols designed to prevent fragmentation and the spread of seeds and rhizomes. Heavy-duty containment bags, tarps, and protective gear are used throughout the process, and this level of care is critical because even small fragments of Miscanthus can reestablish and spread. Then collected plant material will then be permanently destroyed at approved facilities and using best practice methods such as improved incineration, or even we have biochar processing here on the island. The key point here is finality. No viable plant material re-enters the environment. But it doesn't end with just commercial removal. Recognizing that invasive species don't just live in nurseries, they live in people's yards. We are extending this work into the community through a plant swap program. Residents will be invited to remove Miscanthus sinensis from their own properties and replace it with native switchgrass, Panicum virgatum, or other native bunch grasses such as big blue stem or Indian grass, little blue stem, what have you. So this is a hands-on positive exchange. Residents don't just lose a plant, but they gain a native alternative that provides habitat, improves soil health, and aligns with Massachusetts invasive species regulations. Just as importantly, the swap creates a moment of education and engagement. It turns compliance into stewardship. Together, these efforts demonstrate a cost-effective, community-driven model for invasive species prevention by intervening early at the point of sale and preparing removal with education and native replacement. We're protecting biodiversity, strengthening ecosystem resilience, and advanced climate adaptation goals. It's a reminder that sometimes the most impactful conservation work isn't just dramatic or reactive. It's preventative, collaborative, and rooted in community trust. And that's it. Thank Thank you.
Thanks,
I realize
Rich.
I'm the last talk before lunch, so go feed your faces.
Hi, sorry, Sarah, go ahead if you were moderating this.
Yeah, so I just wanted to thank everybody for being here for this last session. Once again, if you have questions for Rich and his program and project with Miscanthus, which I have a few, we can add them to the chat. And then Kelly has the information for lunchtime.
Hi, so I'm Kelly Ullman, Nantucket Conservation Foundation. I'm also a member of the Sandplain Grassland Network. I just wanted to thank Rich. Miscanthus has been a big thing for us, and I wish we had more time to chat about Miscanthus. We do have a PSA for you. I've been asked to introduce Abby Marino, and she has a short piece of information about something that's upcoming that'll be great for us, and then we'll talk again for discussion.
Hello, can you see that slide?
Yes.
Awesome. Yes, this is Abby from the Long Island Invasive Species Management Area, and thank you to the Sandplain Grassland Network for a wonderful conference so far. I'd like to share this upcoming event, the Resilient Long Island Symposium. It's coming up on March 20th at Hofstra University and will feature content on local ecology, native plants, and invasive species. Particularly for you guys, we're still looking for poster presenters for the evening of Thursday, March 19th. So if you have a research or a management project to share and a poster, please use the QR code or the link that we'll put in the chat to sign up. And poster presenters can come to the main conference for free. And if you need more grasslands in your life, there will also be a workshop Saturday, March 21st at the Hempstead Plain. So thank you, and we'd love to see you there.
Thank you, Abby. I don't know if we have any questions. I'm not seeing a lot. Let's see if I scroll down. Yeah, so Karen comments about Nantucket being instrumental in helping to get Miscanthus regulated in Massachusetts, but also the MIPAG group, the Massachusetts Advisory Group for Invasive Plants, was really helpful for that. And there's a lot more information that we can get out of other management methods. Sarah Boyce has a question. Rich, how has the response been from the nurseries? Did you check in with them before submitting the grant? She's wondering if there would be a rush on the plants, a black market for getting the remaining Miscanthus.
Yeah, so I found that they were pretty savvy to it already to be taken off or being prohibited. So they didn't order a lot of stock or this. So they wouldn't be stuck with a lot afterwards. At least that was the case with a couple of them. There's one nursery that had a little more than the others, but yeah. So it looks like they're pretty
Excellent.
good. Yeah, it's more looking into what landscaping companies, if they have any in their stock, they've got to get into.
So we have also found with the Miscanthus that actually cutting the vegetation off the top and flipping them over in place and leaving them to compost is a great way if you're management oriented, and it's harder if you're going to walk away from the site because then there's nobody to monitor following up. But we really love this idea of putting a new plant in its place, especially a native plant. Karen comments that the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group may have been really good in getting the word out that people are going to be not wanting to buy these plants because they're now prohibited and that they're being phased out. So that's a good point. Does anybody else have a quick question? I think we have until 12:45 for questions, and then we'll break for lunch. It's like Chris has a good question. Let's see. There's a lot of evidence from Europe about chronic nitrogen deposition lowering grassland diversity. That's been worked at in Noshawn and Outwash Plain. But he hasn't found evidence that having higher nitrogen or nitrogen and fertilizer lowers diversity. And maybe the reason for this is that the soils are naturally low in nitrogen and don't retain it very well. He's suggesting looking at the evidence from the Hubbard Brook ecosystem study, looking at N deposition going down and soils returning to their earlier nitrogen poor state pretty quickly. That's a really interesting point. And Kevin Ormerod is mentioning from Blue Stem Meadows an agreement on that, and the discussion of the logistics of how quickly the conversion to an altered species population occurs, and about how the woody species may be benefiting from alterations. and the exponential maintenance needs required to get it back to a certain state. Kevin, did you have anything more to say about that? He's here still.
Oh, I'm here.
Yeah, did you have anything
I'm
else
here.
to add?
Oh, sorry, I mute that. Well, I guess it was just mainly an interest to bring that topic up. And again, what I'm noticing here in Rhode Island is things are really, really very quickly, within just a few years, turning into states that are hardly recognizable. And it's impressive what these species can do. And again, a lot of them are physically altering the soils in many different ways. And nitrogen was just one of the ways, the phosphorus, silica, the amino acids of the nitrogen, the form of the nitrogen, the soil carbon, the stability of the soil carbon, all like the forms of the molecules. Just wanting to bring to light and curious of how they are molecularly changing and how that's, again, aiding the further invasion of plants.
Chris, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really interesting question. We some colleagues of mine and I wrote a proposal not that long ago that we didn't get funded, but we haven't given up on the idea that there's this sort of cascade of changes that goes along with either agriculture or now increasing spread of residential areas where people are putting lime on lawns and changing the pH is nitrogen change, I think, especially in these really sandy soils, it's different if you're elsewhere. It can be pretty short-lived. Nitrogen, these soils don't hold nitrogen. Nitrogen will leach out. If we've done a great job of lowering N deposition in the eastern United States. It's about a third of what it was 25 years ago. And soils respond by becoming more nitrogen impoverished. So we're going, because of the Clean Air Act, we're going back to these conditions that favor these plants, native plants that like nutrient poor soils. The thing that takes a very long time to undo is changes in pH.
Absolutely, yeah.
That triggers potentially a lot of other cascading changes because a lot of these, say, cool season grasses or invasive species like bittersweet, they just do well in a sweeter, higher pH soil, and those changes take decades to undo. So I think it's a very interesting question, and I think we have to think of it when we're trying to, like what Patrick was talking about, that site at Bamford was limed heavily because it was a dairy pasture for a long, long time. Its soil had a high pH. Now it's very hard to undo. It's not shrubby, but it's very hard to undo those cool season grasses, which like those sweeter soil conditions. And so, it's a decades long process, compared to I think the nitrogen leaching question. Anyway, that's just my perspective on it, having thought about it.
Yeah, no, I precisely agree with the niche, the plants that that have the community that will take over a specific niche soil type, and that's definitely you nailed it there. And
great,
yeah.
Thank you, guys. We need to wrap up to give some time for some people to do some checks for logistics for the next section. We're going to break for lunch. Check out some more items in the chat before you do that or after lunch. So we'll be returning and starting up again at 1:15, but now is a good time for people that are presenting to do system checks. Thank you.